Everett Crow slammed the paper down on the counter so hard the ink jar tipped sideways, and his smile, that slow, oily smile of a man who had never once been told, no made Cora Whitlock's stomach turn before she even read a single word. "Sign it," he said, "or your father loses everything by Friday." She was 19 years old. She had flour on her hands and a bruise on her collarbone from where she'd walked into the barn door in the dark the night before. She had never been to the county seat. She had never spoken to a judge or a lawyer or anyone who wore a pressed suit on a Tuesday afternoon. And she was standing in a banker's office being told her life was now a transaction. If that were you, if someone handed you a marriage certificate and told you to sign it or watch your family destroyed, what would you do? Before we go any further, if you're new here, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. These are the stories that stay with you. And if you're watching from somewhere across the world, drop your city or country in the comments. I read every single one, and I love seeing how far these stories travel. Hit that like button too. It means more than you know. Now let's go back to the day everything changed for Cora Whitlock. The morning Cora signed her name to Everett Crow's paper, the sky outside was the color of dirty dishwater, and there was a cold wind coming down off the mountain that rattled the glass in every window on Main Street. She noticed that because she was trying not to cry and focusing on small things, the rattle of glass, the ink stain spreading slowly across the desk blotter. The way Everett's gold watch chain caught the light was the only way she could keep herself from falling apart completely. Her father stood beside her. That was the worst part. Thomas Whitlock was a big man, broad through the shoulders, the kind of man who had hauled fence posts and broken ground and delivered calves in the rain for 40 years without complaint. But that morning, he stood with his hat in his hands and his eyes fixed on the floor, and he looked smaller than Cora had ever seen him. She wanted to grab his arm and say, "Papa, this isn't right. This can't be right. Tell him no." But she already knew what he would say. He'd been saying it for 3 weeks. Ever since the bank notice arrived at their farm, he'd say that there was nothing to be done, that the debt was real, that the numbers didn't lie. Except Cora had looked at the numbers. She hadn't told her father that. She wasn't sure why. Except that she'd gone through the old ledger at the kitchen table 2 nights before while he slept, adding columns by lamplight, and what she found had made her hands shake in a way she didn't know how to explain. The sums didn't match. They hadn't matched for years. But she was 19, and she had a 3rd-grade formal education, and she genuinely thought that she must be wrong. So she signed the paper.
Everett Crow picked it up before the ink was dry and held it as if it were something valuable, which it was to him.
He gave her a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Wise decision," he said. "A very wise decision, Miss Whitlock, or I suppose I should say Mrs. Calder." The name landed on her like a stone dropped into still water. She felt the ripple go all the way through her. She had heard the name before. Everyone in Ashford had Bram Calder, the mountain man. The one who lived alone up on Blackpine Ridge and came down maybe twice a year for supplies. And when he did, children crossed to the other side of the street. He was scarred, that much was certain. She'd seen him once, years before, from a distance, and the sight had startled her badly enough that she'd grabbed her father's sleeve without thinking. Something had happened to the left side of his face. She didn't know what. Nobody knew for certain. The stories people told about how he'd gotten it were worse than the scar itself. The story she'd heard most often was that he had caused it himself. That particular story was why Cora walked down the steps of Everett Crow's bank that afternoon with her legs barely working and her mind going very quiet in the way minds go quiet when the body is, preparing for something it can't survive any other way. Her father tried to hold her hand. She let him, but she didn't squeeze back. "It'll be all right," he said. "He's agreed to provide for you." That was part of the arrangement. "Provide for me," she repeated. The words came out flat as a stone. "Cora, I know, Papa." She stopped on the bottom step and looked up at the ridge in the distance, barely visible through the cloud cover, dark with pine trees that seemed to go on forever. "I know. She had 1 week. That week was simultaneously the longest and shortest of her life. She packed what she owned, which wasn't much: 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, a wooden comb, a small tint-teep photograph of the family taken when she was 8 years old and her mother was still alive. She tried not to think too hard about what she was walking into. When the thinking got too loud, she went to the barn and worked until her arms ached, which had always been her mother's advice for fear. Work through it. Work until it's smaller than you are. She didn't sleep the night before. She lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and made a list in her head, the way she'd been taught to do when things were frightening, a list of what she knew for certain. She knew her name was Cora Ann Whitlock, and she was not going to let anyone take that from her. She knew the numbers in that bank ledger didn't add up. She knew her father was a good man who had made a best because he didn't know what else to do. She knew she was going up the mountain tomorrow, and that she was probably terrified for good reason, and that being terrified for good reason was still better than pretending not to be. It wasn't much of a list, but it got her to morning. Bram Calder came for her himself, which surprised everyone. She'd expected a hired hand, or maybe no one at all. She'd half expected to be told to find her own way up the ridge. But he was there at the edge of the property at 6 in the morning, sitting on the bench seat of an old wagon with a roan horse who looked like she'd seen 20 years of rough country and survived all of them. He had his hat pulled down and his coat collar turned up against the cold, and he didn't get down from the wagon. He just waited. Thomas Whitlock walked his daughter out to the wagon. Cora carried her own bag. When they reached the side of the wagon, her father stopped and looked up at Bram Calder, and Cora saw the moment her father took in the left side of the man's face, the scarring that ran from jaw to temple. Puckered and pale against weathered skin, and she saw Thomas go very still. Bram looked down at him. He didn't speak. "You'll treat her right," Thomas said. It wasn't quite a question and wasn't quite a command. It was the kind of thing a man says when he knows he's out of options but needs to say something anyway. Bram Calder looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Cora. His eyes, the thing nobody who told stories about him ever mentioned, were dark brown and completely steady. Not cruel, not angry, just very, very tired, in the way of someone who stopped expecting things from people a long time ago and had gotten used to the quiet of that. "I'll treat her right," he said. His voice was low and even. He said it the same way he might have said the weather was turning. A fact, not a promise made for performance. Cora climbed up onto the wagon seat herself before her father could reach out to help her. She didn't look back as they pulled away. She would have lost the battle with herself if she had. They rode in silence for 40 minutes. The wagon followed a dirt track that wound steadily uphill into the timber, and the air grew colder and smelled more strongly of pine resin, and at some point the town below disappeared entirely behind a curve in the ridge. Cora sat with her bag in her lap and her hands folded on top of it and watched the track ahead. Bram Calder did not attempt to make conversation. He drove the horse with easy, practiced movements, barely seeming to think about it. Once, when a rut nearly bounced Cora sideways off the seat, his right arm came out and steadied her quickly, the way a person catches something out of reflex. Then his arm went back to the reins and he said nothing. She looked at his profile. Up close, the scarring was more complicated than she'd expected older. Some of it, the kind that has faded to silver and settled into the skin rather than sitting on top of it. It covered most of the left side of his jaw and the corner of his eye and disappeared under his collar. She couldn't tell what had caused it, and she didn't ask. "Do you want me to call you Mr. Calder?" she said. The sound of her own voice startled her a little. She hadn't planned to speak. He didn't look at her. "Bram, Bram," she repeated, trying the word out like she was checking its weight. "I'm Cora. I know who you are. That was all." They rode another 20 minutes in quiet. The house on Blackpine Ridge was nothing like she'd imagined. She'd imagined something that matched the story's dark, tumble-down, maybe threatening in some architectural way she couldn't quite define. What she found instead was a solid, square log house with a good roof and a porch that had been recently repaired, and a kitchen garden that was bare for winter, but whose fence lines were straight and well maintained. There was an outhouse, a spring house, a barn that was larger than the house, and a shed full of split wood stacked to the rafters. It was the home of someone who worked very hard and cared about the work itself, if not necessarily about company. Bram helped her down from the wagon. He took her bag, set it on the porch, came around and offered his hand without looking at her, like the motion was automatic. Took it. His hand was massive and calloused and very warm, and she was surprised by the warmth. Inside, he showed her her room. It had a bed, a window, a small stove, a hook on the wall for clothing. It was spare but clean. The quilt on the bed was old and beautifully made, the kind of thing made by a woman who had cared about the person who would sleep under it. She stood in the doorway looking at it. "This is your room," he said from behind her. "I sleep at the end of the hall. I won't come in here unless you open that door and ask me to." He paused. "That's not a negotiation. That's just the way it is." She turned around and looked at him. He was standing in the hall, big and still, his hands at his sides, and he met her eyes when she looked at him, which nobody else in her life had managed to do that day. "Why?" she asked. He didn't pretend not to understand the question. "Because I was told to take a wife and I did," he said, "and that's all it needs to be." He started to turn away, then stopped. "There's food in the kitchen. You can use whatever you need." "I'll be in the barn." He was in the barn until dark. She ate alone at the kitchen table and listened to the wind move through the pine trees outside, which was a different sound than she'd ever heard before, deeper and more constant, like breathing. She washed the dishes. She looked around the kitchen for what she could determine about the man who lived here. Practical man, she decided. Nothing decorative, nothing frivolous, but everything functional and maintained with quiet care. No liquor bottles, which surprised her. A shelf of books above the fireplace, mostly surveying records and farming manuals, but tucked in among them, spine broken from use, a collection of poems by someone she didn't recognize. She pulled the poetry book out and held it. The spine was so worn she couldn't read the title. Inside the front cover, in handwriting that was not Bram's, she could tell by the lightness of the pen pressure, the careful loop someone had written, for B. "So you remember there are beautiful things, no date. No name." She put it back exactly where she'd found it. There was a door at the end of the hall, past Bram's room. It was the only door in the house that was closed, and she noticed it the way you notice a word you don't know. In a sentence, it snagged her attention and wouldn't let go. She didn't try the handle. She told herself it was storage and went to her room. She did not fall apart that night. She came close, once lying in the dark listening to the wind, once after she woke from a dream about her mother and realized she couldn't remember exactly what her mother's voice sounded like anymore. Both times she breathed through it and held very still until it passed. In the morning, Bram was in the kitchen when she came out. He'd already made coffee. He was standing at the window with a cup in his hand, looking out at something in the yard, and he glanced at her when she came in, and then back at the window. She poured herself coffee. She sat at the table. She said, "Good morning." He said, "Morning." Then after a pause, "There's oats." It was, she thought, possibly the most stripped-down conversation she'd ever had with another human being. And yet there was something about it, the fact that he had made coffee, the fact that he had mentioned the oats, the fact that he was standing in the same room as another person and not clearly miserable about it. That was not what she'd been prepared for. She'd been prepared for cruelty or rage, or at least contempt. She had not been prepared for a man who made coffee in the morning and told her there were oats. She found herself somewhere in the hour that followed while she made the oats, and he went back outside, and the wind moved through the pines, and the light came slowly through the kitchen window, allowing herself to consider the faintest, smallest possibility. That this might not be what everyone told her it was. And then, 2 days later, she found the bank ledger. She wasn't looking for it. She had been exploring the house the way you explore a space you've been told is yours to use carefully, with permission, but fully, and she had opened the wrong drawer in the study desk, looking for paper to write a letter to her father. And there it was. A ledger, not Bram's household accounts, but something else. Something with Everett Crow's name inside the front cover. A ledger that by any reasonable explanation should not have existed in this house at all. She sat down on the floor right there, in front of the open drawer, and she opened it. The first column of figures made her breath come a little shorter. The second column made her stomach drop. By the third page, her hands were shaking again, but not the same way they'd shaken before, when she was afraid. This time they were shaking because she had just looked at numbers that told a story, a very clear story, and that story was not the story she had been told, and it was not the story her father had believed, and it was not any version of events in which Everett Crow was a legitimate businessman who was simply owed a debt. It was the story of a man who had invented a debt. She was still sitting on the floor when she heard Bram's boots on the porch steps, and she closed the ledger, and she put it back in the drawer, and she sat for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the desk, thinking. She thought about Everett Crow's smile, that slow, oily smile. The way he'd said wise decision as though he were doing her a favor. She thought about her father standing with his hat in his hands, looking smaller than she'd ever seen him. She thought about the quilt on her bed and the poetry book with the worn spine and the door at the end of the hall. And she thought, if that debt was fabricated, then her marriage was not a transaction born of her family's failure. It was something else, something deliberate. She was not a pawn in a debt collection. She was a piece in a game she hadn't known she was sitting down to play. The question she couldn't answer yet. Sitting on that floor with her hand flat against the desk and the wind loud in the pine trees outside was what the game was really for. And whether Bram Calder knew he was playing it too. She pulled the drawer open again. She took the ledger out, and this time she brought it to the kitchen table, and she sat down in the full morning light, and she started from the beginning. She was still reading when Bram walked in an hour later. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen, looked at the ledger on the table. Looked at her. Something moved across his face, not anger, not panic, something quieter and more complicated than either. He crossed the room in 3 steps and stood at the edge of the table and looked down at the pages she'd opened to, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Cora looked up at him and said, very carefully, "This isn't your ledger." "No," he said, "it isn't. It's Everett Crow's." "Yes, and it shows that my father's debt was inflated. It shows numbers that don't match what my father was told he owed." She kept her voice steady. She was not going to get through this if she didn't keep her voice steady. "Bram, how long have you had this?" He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He looked at the ledger a moment longer, then at her. His face was difficult to read. It had always been difficult to read, but she was beginning to understand that what looked like coldness in him was usually something else. Something held very tightly, because he had learned long ago that letting it go had consequences he wasn't willing to live through again. "Long enough," he said, "long enough." She waited. "That's all you're going to say." For now, she closed the ledger. "Put her hand flat on the cover," said Bram. "Everett Crow used my father's debt, a debt he manufactured to force me into this marriage. Which means he used this marriage for something. What is he trying to get?" Bram was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "This mountain." She looked at him. He looked back at her, steady and tired in the way she was coming to recognize as simply his face when he was telling the truth. "Blackpine Ridge," she said slowly. "Railroad company wants to run a line through the valley below. To do it right, they need an easement through the north face of this property. Everett has been negotiating the contract. The commission on that deal is," he stopped. Seemed to recalculate. "It's enough that a man like Everett would do exactly what he did." Cora sat with that for a moment, and "You," she said. "Do you owe him money? Real money, that you actually borrowed?" Pause. "Yes, with the mountain as collateral." He looked at her steadily. Yes. She took a slow breath. So his plan, she said, working it out as she said it, is to pressure you into selling. And if you don't sell, he ruins you financially. And if you're ruined, the property goes to your next of kin. She stopped, looked at him, which is now me. Yes. And then he'd pressure me. Or force me out another way. Yes. She looked down at the ledger. Then back up at Bram Calder, this man she'd been told was a monster, sitting across from her at his own kitchen table, with his big hands quiet on the wood and his dark eyes steady and exhausted, and she realized now worried. Not for himself. She could tell the difference. He was worried for her. How long have you known? She asked again. Since before Crow approached your father, he said. I knew what he was building toward. I tried to pay off my own debt before he could use it. Stopped. His jaw tightened. I couldn't move fast enough. So you let this happen. I had no legal ground. I had no proof that would hold. His voice didn't rise. And I told myself. He stopped again, and this time the stop was longer and had more weight in it. You told yourself what? She asked. He looked away toward the window. That whoever he brought into this, I would make sure she was protected. The kitchen was very quiet. The wind moved through the pine trees outside. Cora Whitlock looked at the man who was her husband by a banker's arrangement and a desperate father's signature, and she thought about the separate room and the steady eyes and the coffee made in the morning without ceremony or expectation. And she thought about the quilt and the locked door and the weight behind the words, I will make sure she was protected. And she thought, whatever this is, it's not what I was told it was. It was something stranger and more complicated, and she suspected, more dangerous. Because a man who had stood on the edge of all this and chosen protection over escape was not a man with simple reasons. And his reasons, she was only beginning to feel the edges of them, were the kind that changed a story from the outside in. She looked at the ledger. She put her hand on it again. Then we're going to need proof, she said. Bram looked back at her. She met his eyes, real proof, the kind that holds. If Everett Crow invented my father's debt, and he's engineered this whole arrangement to steal your mountain, then we are going to prove it, and we are going to make him answer for it. Bram stared at her. Something in his expression shifted barely, like the first crack in a frozen thing, and he said, Cora. I know, she said. I know it's dangerous. I know I'm 19 and I've never done anything like this and I don't know what I'm doing. She looked at him steadily. But I know numbers, and I know what those numbers say. And I know that man smiled at me when I signed that paper and told me it was a wise decision. And I want to make sure, before this is over, that I get to see his face when someone tells him the same thing. Bram Calder looked at his wife, the woman he'd taken in to protect, the woman he'd expected to be afraid, the woman who was sitting at his kitchen table with her hand flat on a damning ledger and her jaw set and her eyes clear, and for a long, long moment he just looked at her. Then he said, all right. It was not a grand declaration. It was not a turning point dressed in ceremony. It was 2 words in a quiet kitchen on a mountain under siege. But it was enough. The word all right hung in the kitchen air between them like something fragile, and Cora was careful not to press on it too hard. She'd seen what happened when you pushed a man like Bram Calder not with cruelty, not with force, but just by expecting too much too fast. He closed, not like a door slamming, more like a window being pulled shut against a coming storm. Quiet, final, and she wasn't going to lose the ground she'd just gained by being impatient about it. So she didn't ask him to explain himself further that morning. She made more coffee. She put the ledger in her room under the mattress, which was not a sophisticated hiding place, but was the one she had. And she spent the rest of that day doing what she'd been doing since she arrived, learning the rhythms of the house, watching how Bram moved through it, trying to build a map of the man from the evidence he left behind without meaning to. What she found was this: he was meticulous about the barn and careless about the house. He fed the animals before himself every single morning without exception. He had a habit of standing at the kitchen window with his coffee and looking out at the ridge, not at anything specific, just looking. The way a person looks at something they're afraid might disappear if they stop watching it. He didn't whistle or hum or make the small, unconscious sounds that people make when they're comfortable. He was almost always silent, but it was not an angry silence. It was the silence of someone who had lived alone long enough that sound had stopped feeling necessary. And there was the door. She thought about the door at the end of the hall a lot in those first 2 weeks. It was an ordinary door, the same plain pine as the others, the same black iron latch, but it was the only one in the house that was always closed, and the only one she never heard him open. Not in the morning, not at night, not during any of the long afternoons when she heard him moving through the house to refill his coffee, or come in from the cold to warm his hands at the kitchen stove. That door stayed shut. She was not afraid of it exactly. She was curious about it in the particular way you get curious about things that people go out of their way not to mention, which meant they mattered. On the 14th day, she asked him. They were at the kitchen table after dinner, a meal that had graduated for 2 weeks, from them eating at separate times to them eating at the same time in separate silences to something that now occasionally involved sentences, and she said, without particularly planning to, the room at the end of the hall. What's in it? Bram set down his fork. He didn't look at her. He looked at the table for a moment, and she could see the thing happening in him, the closing, the pulling back, and she said quickly, You don't have to tell me. I'm not trying to push. I notice things I'm not supposed to ask about, and I can't always stop myself. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she picked up her own fork and kept eating, giving him room. Then he said, My daughter's room. She put the fork down again. Her name was Ellie, he said. His voice was the same low, even tone he used for everything. But there was something underneath it now, like a plank bowing under too much weight. She was 4. Her mother's name was Ruth. He stopped. They died in the Hallow Creek mine collapse 11 years ago. There was a fault in the main shaft that the company knew about and didn't report. 17 people went down that morning. His jaw moved. 2 came back up. Cora said nothing. There was nothing to say that wasn't either inadequate or intrusive, and she'd learned young that silence was sometimes the only honest response. I kept the room the way it was, he said. I know that's... He stopped again. Start it over. I'm not unaware of how it looks. It looks like you loved her, Cora said. Quiet, no decoration on it. He looked at her then. Just for a moment, then back at the table. I locked it, he said, because I couldn't look at it every day and still keep going. And I couldn't empty it because he stopped a 3rd time, and this time he didn't start over. He just let the sentence stay unfinished, and she understood that the end of it was the kind of thing that didn't have a right word. You don't have to explain it to me, she said. I understand keeping things. He looked at her again, this time for longer. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen from him before, not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. Like he'd expected her to flinch or say something consoling and practiced and wrong, and she hadn't. Your mother, he said. A guess? Or maybe something he'd worked out on his own. 3 years ago, she said, fever fast. She picked up her fork again. I still have the comb she used every morning. I can't throw it away, and I don't use it. It's in my bag. He nodded once, slowly. They finished dinner in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than it had been before. Something had shifted in the room, the way air shifts before rain, and Cora felt it in the back of her throat. Not relief exactly. Something quieter. The particular feeling of being slightly less alone than you were an hour ago. It was 3 days after that conversation that things on the mountain changed. She heard the horse before she saw the rider, a single set of hooves on the track below the house, coming up fast, which was unusual because nobody came up the track to Blackpine Ridge on purpose. Bram was already at the window when she reached the kitchen, and the set of his shoulders told her before she could see anything that this was not a welcome visitor. It was a man named Garrett, who worked at the livery in Ashford and ran errands for the bank on the side, which was the kind of arrangement common enough in small towns that nobody thought to question it. He had a message, a folded paper that he handed to Bram without getting off his horse, and Bram opened it right there on the porch, standing in the cold, and Cora stood in the doorway behind him and watched his face. She couldn't see what the paper said. She could see what it did. His face went flat and very still, not angry, worse than angry. The expression of a man who has just had a fear confirmed. Garrett rode away. Bram stood on the porch a moment longer, then turned and came inside and handed Cora the paper without a word. It was a loan notice, 30 days to pay the balance in full, or the property defined on the attached page in legal language that she had to read twice would be subject to foreclosure proceedings. The balance listed was almost 3 times what Bram had told her he owed. She looked at the number a long time. Then she said, "That's not what he borrowed, is it?" "No, he inflated it, same as he did with my father." "Yes." She set the paper down on the kitchen table and looked at it the way she'd looked at the bank ledger on the floor of the study, with a particular focus of someone who has just had the pieces rearrange themselves into a shape she recognizes. "He's moving," she said. "He's speeding up the timeline." Which means something has changed. Something made him nervous. Bram sat down at the table across from her. He looked at the notice. He said, "Or someone." She raised her eyes. "What do you mean?" He rubbed his jaw. 3 weeks before Crow sent the first notice to your father, a man came to Ashford and asked questions at the county clerk's office. Property records, about loan histories. He paused. Nobody paid much attention. He registered at the boarding house as a traveling surveyor. But you don't think he was. Surveyors don't ask about bank ledgers. Cora leaned forward on the table. "You think someone was already investigating Crow?" "I think it's possible. Then why hasn't anything happened? If someone's been investigating him for months." "Because investigating and proving are different things," Bram said. His voice was patient, but not condescending, the voice of someone who had spent a long time thinking about the gap between those two words. Crow is careful. He keeps his name off the worst of it. He uses other people to move money and papers, the ledger you found in my desk. He stopped. "How did you get it?" she asked. She'd been wondering since the first morning. "His clerk," Bram said. Name was Denton. Young man, first year out of his apprenticeship, and Crow made the mistake of treating him the way he treats everyone, like he was disposable. "Denton came to me last spring. He'd copied what he could." His jaw tightened. "He left Ashford a month later. Said Crow had found out he'd been asking questions." He was frightened. Is he all right?" The question seemed to catch Bram slightly off guard. He looked at her. "As far as I know," he said, "he went to his sister's family." "Different county." She nodded, looked at the loan notice again. "So you have the ledger, but you don't have Denton to verify it. And without someone to testify to how it was obtained and what it means. It's just a piece of paper that could have come from anywhere." "Right," she drummed her fingers once on the table. "We need more. We need something that connects Crow to more than just us. Something that shows this is a pattern, not an isolated." She stopped. Looked up at him. "You said he'd ruined families, plural." "Several," Bram said. "The Harmon farm south of town. The Pelletier family, they had a mill. The widow Gaines, who owned 3 acres of river frontage that Crow wanted for a warehouse." His voice got very dry and flat on each name, the way voices get when the dryness is holding something heavier behind it. All of them got notices. All of them lost their properties. Most of them left the county. Cora was quiet for a moment. "Most of them," she said. "Mrs. Gaines is still in Ashford," he said. "Living with her daughter. Then I need to talk to her." Bram looked at her steadily. "Cora, I know you're going to tell me it's not safe." "It's not safe. Going to Ashford and asking questions about Everett Crow, who has armed men on retainer and a judge in his pocket. I don't know for certain about the judge. You suspect." He didn't argue it. "Yes." She stood up, picked up the loan notice and folded it and put it in her apron pocket. "Then I'll be careful," she said. "But Bram sitting here waiting for him to foreclose is not a plan. If we don't build a case that's bigger than just us, he wins. He's built this whole thing so that if anyone pushes back, It looks like a single disgruntled debtor making accusations. We need to show it's more than that. He looked at her for a long time. She could see him working through it the way he had of being very still while he thought. So still you might mistake it for not thinking at all if you didn't watch his eyes. There's a woman in town, he said finally, Mary Beth Calhoun. She runs the dry goods. She sees everything and remembers everything, and she hates Everett Crow with a specific and historical passion that I've always respected. He paused. She knew my wife. Cora held his gaze. Will she talk to me? If you tell her the truth, she has very little patience for anything that isn't the truth. Good, Cora said. Neither do I. She went into Ashford 2 days later, on the supply run that Bram made every few weeks. He drove, said nothing for most of the ride down, and then, as they reached the edge of town before the first buildings came into view, he said without looking at her, If Crow is in town, you don't approach him. You don't let him know what you're doing. You buy thread and anything else you can plausibly need, and you have a natural conversation with Mary Beth, and we come home. Understood, she said. And if anyone asks, I'm just the mountain man's wife making do. She looked at him sideways. I can do that. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something smaller than a smile, but in the same family. I know, he said. Ashford in December was not a warm place. The streets were half-frozen mud, and the cold came off the mountains in waves that pushed people along the boardwalks with their heads down and their collars turned up. Cora felt eyes on her when they came down Main Street, not hostile, more the particular curiosity of a small town that has heard a story and is now seeing the actual person. She kept her chin level and her expression neutral and reminded herself she was Thomas Whisk's daughter, and Thomas Whitlock's daughter did not flinch on public streets, no matter what was being thought about her. Mary Beth Calhoun was a small woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and the kind of face that had seen enough of the world to have stopped being surprised by most of it. She was stacking bolts of cotton when Cora came in, and she turned and looked at her with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was absolutely assessing. You're Cora Calder, she said. Not a question, I am, Cora said. You look like you have something on your mind that isn't thread. I do, Cora said, but I'll buy thread too. Mary Beth set down the bolt she was holding and looked at Cora with her full attention, which was, Cora had a feeling, a somewhat rare thing to earn. Bram sent you in, she said. Bram drove me in. The errand is mine. The older woman was quiet for a moment. Then she went to the door of the shop and flipped the sign to close it and came back and said, Sit down. I'll put the kettle on. What Cora learned in the next hour, over tea that tasted like pine and dried mint, was this. Mary Beth Calhoun had watched Everett Crow build his scheme loan by loan, foreclosure by foreclosure, for the better part of a decade. She had watched the Harmon family lose their farm, and the Pelletier mill go silent, and the widow Gaines reduced to her daughter's spare room. She had watched it all with the helpless fury of someone who sees clearly, but has no lever long enough to move anything. Tried, Mary Beth said. I wrote to the county assessor. I wrote to the State Banking Commission. I got letters back that said the transactions had been reviewed and found to be in order. She wrapped both hands around her teacup, which means either nobody looked or somebody got paid not to look. There's a ledger, Cora said. She hadn't planned to say it that directly, but Mary Beth was not a person you danced around. With Crow's name in it, showing inflated balances. Including my father's debt, Mary Beth stared at her. It's at the house, Cora said, on Blackpine Ridge. How did Bram get that? Through his clerk, man named Denton. Mary Beth was quiet for a moment, her eyes working through something. Then she said quietly, Denton's sister lives in this county. I know her, Margaret Denton, married name Forsyth. She lives 12 miles south. She paused. Would Thomas Denton testify? I don't know, Cora admitted. He was frightened enough to leave. But if there were other people, if we could show him it wasn't just us. That other people were willing to stand up. You want me to talk to people, Mary Beth said. Not a question. I want to know if there are people who would talk. Even if they just kept their papers, even if they just have records that don't match what Crow told them. Cora leaned forward. I'm not asking anyone to do anything dangerous. Not yet. I just need to know what we're working with. Mary Beth looked at her for a long time. She had very dark eyes that did not move around when she was thinking. They stayed level and still, focused on whatever she was looking at, and Cora had the feeling of being genuinely seen by someone who didn't do it carelessly. You're not what I expected, Mary Beth said finally. Nobody's said that to me as a compliment before, Cora said. But I'll take it. Mary Beth surprised her then. She laughed. It was a short, dry laugh, but it was real, and it broke something open in the room. All right, Mrs. Calder, I'll see who'll talk. She stood, picking up both cups. But you need to understand something. Crow has friends in this town. Friends who report to him. You came in today on the supply run, and that's normal enough. But if you start coming in regularly, asking around, he'll know. I understand. And she stopped, softened slightly, which Cora noticed. How is he? Quiet, Cora said. Careful, stubborn. She paused. Better than people think. Mary Beth nodded slowly. He was a good man before, she said. Before Hallow Creek. He was a different kind of man. He and Ruth used to... She stopped herself. He closed up very hard after, we all understood it. But it was like watching a house get boarded up. You could see the light go out room by room. Cora didn't say anything. She was thinking about the poetry book on the shelf. For B, so you remember there are beautiful things. She was thinking about the locked door. She was thinking about a man who made coffee in the morning without being asked and said 2 words all right when someone gave him a reason to keep going. She was thinking that boarding up a house didn't mean the house was empty. They left Ashford before noon. Bram loaded the supplies into the wagon bed and asked no questions until they were past the first turn in the road, out of sight of the town, and then he said, Well? Mary Beth will make inquiries, Cora said, carefully. She thinks there are people who kept their records. People who might talk if they weren't standing alone. She looked at the road ahead. And she mentioned Thomas Denton's sister lives south of here. Bram's hands tightened slightly on the reins, just slightly. You think he'd come back. I think if we can give him enough people around him that he doesn't feel like the only target, maybe. She paused. I also think we need to know more about the railroad deal. Who they're actually dealing with. Whether Crow has committed them to anything in writing. I know one of the surveyors they sent out last spring, Bram said. Man named Aldous. He's not in Crow's pocket, he's a company man. Different loyalties. I could write to him. Do it, she said. Then quieter, Bram. When Crow sent that loan notice, that 30-day notice, what did you feel? He was quiet for a moment. Tired, he said. I felt tired. She nodded. Not scared? I've been scared of this for 2 years. You run out of scared eventually. It just becomes the weight you're carrying. He glanced at her sideways. Why? Because I want to know what we're actually fighting for, she said. Not the mountain specifically, not just the property. She looked at the road. You've been alone up there for 11 years. You've been carrying Hallow Creek and the locked door and a ledger you didn't know how to use. You've been trying to protect yourself from something without being sure it was worth protecting. He said nothing. Is it? She asked. Worth it? He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought again he wasn't going to answer. The wagon moved up the track, the pines closing in on either side, and the light was the thin silver light of a winter afternoon, and the horse's breath came in small white clouds. Then Bram said, There's a field on the north face. Sheltered side of the ridge. The soil there is different, deeper, better drained. I always thought. He stopped, started again differently. Ellie liked apples. She used to ask me for them every time I came down from the ridge. I always thought someday I'd plant an orchard up there. He paused. In that field where the soil's right, Cora looked at him. He didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the road and his hands on the reins, and his jaw was working slightly, the way it did when he was pressing something down. I haven't thought about that in a long time, he said. Stopped. Not until what? She asked. He glanced at her. Quick, not until recently, he said. She held that, turned to look ahead again at the ridge, dark with pines against a white sky, massive and cold and very beautiful in its way. Then we're fighting for the orchard, she said. Quiet. No ceremony on it. Among other things, he said nothing. But she saw his hands relax slightly on the reins. That night, while Bram was in the barn doing the evening feeding, Cora went to the study and sat at the desk with the ledger and a piece of paper and began to write down every discrepancy she could find. Column by column, date by date, she cross-referenced it against what she remembered of her father's original loan agreement, the one she'd seen in Crow's office though hadn't been allowed to keep. She wrote everything down in a hand that was small and careful and would have made her old school teacher proud, though her old school teacher had mostly despaired of her. She was halfway through the second page when she heard the creak of the floorboard outside the study door and looked up to find Bram standing in the doorway, coffee cup in hand, looking at what she was doing. You don't have to do that tonight, he said. I know, she said. I want to. He was quiet a moment. Then he walked in and set the coffee cup on the desk next to her and pulled up the other chair and sat down. And he took the ledger and turned to the section he knew best, she could tell, by the way his hands went directly to the right page, and he said, this section here. The dates don't match the deposit records. The loan was processed 2 weeks before the deposit shows on Crow's side, which means he created the debt before the money moved, she said, which means there was no actual loan. He manufactured the paperwork after the fact. She leaned over to look at what he was pointing at. His shoulder was an inch from hers. She was aware of that in the practical, cataloging way she was aware of most things noted, filed, no action required. Can we prove that? She said. If we can get the bank's deposit ledger to compare against this one, he said, which is inside the bank, which Crow controls. What about the federal bank examiner? Do they get copies? He looked at her. Possibly, he said. He paused. That's actually worth asking about. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the page. How do you think of these things? I just ask what should have happened if everything was honest, she said. And then I look at what actually happened. The gap between them is where Crow lives. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same neighborhood. Something short and low and surprised. She looked at him. The lamp on the desk caught the good side of his face, the right side, unscathed, with the line of his jaw and the shadow under his cheekbone, and the dark eye that was, in this light, not tired so much as very much alive. She looked away again, back at the paper. They worked for 2 more hours, side by side, until the lamp burned low, and Cora's hand cramped from writing, and Bram's coffee had long gone cold. When they finally stopped, the list of discrepancies filled 3 pages in her careful hand, and what it showed organized and laid out, cross-referenced and annotated, was not just a man who had inflated a debt. It was a system, a deliberate years-long system of invented debt and manufactured crisis, designed to strip families of property they'd worked their whole lives for and hand it to a man who had never worked a day of his life for anything he couldn't take from someone else. Cora looked at those 3 pages and felt something settle in her chest. Not peace, not yet, but the particular steadiness that comes when you've been afraid in the dark and then someone finally turns on a light and the thing that was frightening turns out to be real, but now at least you can see its shape. She gathered the pages and put them with the ledger. Bram, she said. He was already standing, picking up the cold coffee to take to the kitchen. He looked at her. He's going to find out we're looking, she said. Not if. When. He nodded. I know. And when he does, he's not going to send another letter. No, he said. He won't. She looked at him steadily. I'm not afraid of him. He looked back at her just as steadily. You should be, he said. A little. She thought about it. Decided he was right. A little she allowed, but not enough to stop. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he picked up the lamp and said, Good night, Cora. Good night, Bram. She listened to his footsteps go down the hall. She heard them stop briefly, just for a second at the end of the hall, near the closed door, and then move on to his own room. She put her hand on the 3 pages of evidence and the borrowed ledger. Thought about a field on the north face of the mountain, sheltered from the wind, with soil that was deeper and better drained than anywhere else on the ridge. She thought about apples. She thought about a man who had survived 11 years of carrying a grief that could have broken anyone, and who had stood in a kitchen 8 days ago and said all right to a 19-year-old girl who had nothing to offer him except the particular stubbornness of someone with nothing left to lose. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees of Blackpine Ridge, steady and deep, like something breathing. She put out the second lamp and went to bed, and she was not afraid, not the kind of afraid that stops you. And in the morning she would get up, and the work would continue, and neither of them knew yet how close the danger already was. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, for the first time since she'd put her name on Everett Crow's paper and heard him say wise decision in that oily, satisfied voice, Cora Whitlock, Cora Calder did not feel like someone who had lost a game she didn't know she was playing. She felt like someone who had finally picked up the cards. The letter from the railroad surveyor arrived on a Thursday, tucked inside a bundle of supplies that Bram had arranged to have sent up the ridge by a boy from town rather than collecting himself. He'd started doing that, changing the patterns slightly, not going into Ashford on the same days, not following the same track down the mountain twice in a row. Cora had noticed without commenting on it. It was the kind of caution that didn't need to be explained. She was the one who brought the mail inside. She set the rest of the bundle on the kitchen table and stood by the window to read Aldis's letter, because the light was better there, and because she'd gotten into the habit of reading standing up when she was expecting news she might need to react to quickly. The letter was short. Aldis was not a man who wasted paper. What he wrote, in a hand that was precise and slanted slightly to the right, was that the railroad company had indeed negotiated with Everett Crow for an easement through the north face of Blackpine Ridge, and that Crow had represented himself as the sole legal authority on the disposition of that property, and that a preliminary agreement had been signed 6 weeks ago with Crow's name on it as acting agent. Crow's name, on a document transferring rights to land that was not his. Cora read that sentence twice, then she folded the letter, put it in her apron pocket next to the 3 pages of ledger discrepancies she'd taken, to carrying with her the way other women carried a handkerchief, and went to find Bram. He was in the barn, replacing a rotten board in one of the stall walls, and he knew from the way she walked in that it wasn't a casual visit. He set down the hammer and turned to face her, and she handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. His face did the thing it did, went very flat and very still, and then he handed it back to her and said, "He signed a preliminary agreement. 6 weeks ago," she said, "which means he did it before your 30-day notice. Before all of this escalated. He was committing the land before he even started moving against you." "He assumed it would be over by now," Bram said. His voice was quiet and very dry. "He assumed I'd have folded, or been forced to." She looked at him. "Bram, this changes things. He hasn't just inflated your debt and tried to foreclose. He's already acted as if this land is his. He signed a legal document misrepresenting his authority. That's not fraud against a debtor. That's fraud against the railroad company. That's a federal matter." He looked at her for a moment. "The man who was in town last fall," he said slowly. Asking about property records, she caught it the same time he did. "Not a surveyor," she said. "No, someone already building a case against him. Someone federal." She pressed the heel of her hand against the stall post and thought hard. "Bram, if there's a federal investigation already running, and we walk into it without knowing, we could tip something over before it's ready to fall. Or we could give it exactly what it needs." She straightened. "We need to find that man, the one from the boarding house." Finding a man who'd registered under a false profession at a boarding house in a small mountain town was not, as it turned out, as difficult as Cora had expected. What it required was Mary Beth Calhoun, who had a memory for faces and the social network of a woman who had run the only dry goods store in Ashford for 31 years, and who responded to Cora's careful description of the man medium height, dark coat, asked questions at the county clerk's office with immediate and satisfied recognition. Amos read, Mary Beth said. They were in the back of the dry goods store again. The sign flipped to closed again. Tea that tasted of pine and dried mint again. Outside, a light snow was starting to come down, the first real snow of the season, and it made the town look softer than it was. You know him? Cora said. I know of him. He came in here twice for supplies. Quiet man, paid cash, didn't linger. She paused. But here's the thing. He came back last week. He's not at the boarding house, I asked Mrs. Peel, who runs it, and she said he hasn't been back. But I saw him on the street 2 days ago, coming out of the building next to the telegraph office. The building next to the telegraph office, Cora repeated. That's the office the county land agent uses when he's in town. Which the county land agent is not, currently. Mary Beth looked at her steadily over the rim of her teacup. Someone is using that office, who is not the county land agent. Cora sat with that for a moment. I need to talk to him, she said. That may not be wise. Maybe not, Cora said. But we have a letter from a railroad surveyor stating that Crow signed a preliminary land agreement on property he doesn't own and has no legal authority over. And we have a ledger showing systematic fraud against multiple families in this county. And we have 3 pages of discrepancies I've worked out by hand. She met Mary Beth's eyes. If that man is who we think he might be, those things together are worth a great deal more than they are separately. Mary Beth was quiet for a moment. Then she set down her teacup and said, If you go to that office, you go alone. Not with Bram. Bram walking down Main Street on a day that isn't a supply run will be noticed by the wrong people. I know. And if it goes wrong, then I went to ask about the county land agent regarding a property question, Cora said. I'm a new property owner. It's entirely plausible. Mary Beth looked at her with that assessing expression that Cora had come to understand meant she was deciding whether to be impressed or worried. Usually it was both simultaneously. Go, she said. Go now, before the snow gets heavy. The office next to the telegraph building was unlocked, which surprised her. She knocked twice and pushed the door open before anyone answered, because standing on a street in a thickening snowfall was conspicuous in its own way. And she had approximately the time it took for the snow to get heavy before she needed to be back in Mary Beth's store or in the wagon heading home. The man behind the desk was not what she'd expected, which was a recurring experience in her life lately. She'd built a picture in her head from Mary Beth's description, quiet, dark coat, careful, and what she found was a man in his mid-40s with a plain face and reddish-brown hair going gray at the temples, and the particular stillness of someone who has spent a long time learning not to react visibly to surprises. He looked at her when she came in, and he did not reach for anything on the desk, and he did not tell her she had the wrong office. He said, Mrs. Calder. She stopped with her hand still on the doorframe. Close the door, he said. His voice was even. Please. She closed the door. She stayed near it. You know who I am, she said. I know who everyone in this situation is, he said. He hadn't moved from behind the desk. My name is Amos Red. I'm a deputy federal marshal operating under assignment from the circuit office. I've been in Ashford, on and off, since last September. He paused. And I want you to stop what you're doing. She stared at him. Not permanently, he said. Right now. I need you to sit down and listen to me before you do anything else, because you are very close to dismantling 8 months of very careful work. She sat down, not because he told her to, because her legs made the decision independently, which happens sometimes when the ground shifted unexpectedly. You've been building a case, she said. I have, he said. Against Everett Crow for wire fraud, conspiracy to commit land theft, and bribery of a county official. I have paused, something in his expression shifting. I have a significant case. I also have a timeline that does not include your ledger or your letter from Aldous, or your 3 pages of handwritten discrepancies becoming public knowledge before I'm ready to move. She looked at him carefully. How do you know about the letter from Aldous? He held her gaze. Because I'm the one who told Aldous to write it. The office was very quiet. Outside, the snow came down steadily against the single window. "You needed us to have it," she said slowly. "You needed Bram to know what Crow had done with the railroad agreement." "I needed it documented," Amos said, "in the hands of the property owner, so that when we move, there's no question about chain of evidence. The ledger your husband has, that ledger was my problem. It was obtained unofficially by a frightened clerk, and if I use it without corroboration, Crow's lawyers will eat it alive." He leaned forward on the desk. "But if the property owner's wife, a woman who came to this marriage under fraudulent circumstances that are themselves documented in that ledger, identified the discrepancies independently, cross-referenced them against the loan notice, and connected them to a signed railroad agreement that proves Crow was acting fraudulently, it becomes evidence that was built, not planted," she said. "Yes." She sat with that for a moment. There was a particular feeling that went with realizing you'd been a piece of someone else's plan, not a betrayed feeling. Not exactly. Because Amos Red was apparently trying to put Everett Crow in prison, and she was entirely in favor of that outcome. But something that wanted to push back slightly. "You could have told us," she said. "Earlier. If I'd told you earlier, you'd have behaved differently," he said. "You'd have been careful in the wrong ways. The fact that you were genuinely investigating, that your anger was real, that your questions in this town were honest, that matters. People saw you. They saw a young woman who'd been wronged, trying to figure out what happened to her. That's not the same as a coordinated operation." He paused. "People respond differently to one than the other." She thought about Mary Beth Calhoun, who had watched Crow ruin families for a decade and had written letters to authorities who sent back letters saying everything was in order. She thought about what it had meant to Mary Beth to have someone come into her store and ask questions with genuine personal fury behind them. "The other families," she said, "the Harmons, the Pelletiers, the widow Gaines. I've been in contact," Amos said. "Carefully. Most of them kept records. Not because they thought it would ever matter, just because people keep things." He looked at her. "Mrs. Gaines kept everything. Every letter, every notice, every document Crow ever sent her. She has it in a box under her bed at her daughter's house." "Will they testify?" "They'll testify if they believe it will hold," he said. "Which is why timing matters. If Crow gets wind of this before I'm ready to move, before I have federal authorization for an arrest and a warrant for his records, he will destroy what he can and run with what he can't. He has resources. He has the means to disappear." She looked at him steadily. "What do you need from us?" "I need Bram to continue refusing to sell. I need you to continue appearing to investigate on your own, which in practical terms means you keep doing exactly what you've been doing, just not anywhere near this office, and not through any channel Crow can monitor." He paused. "And I need about 3 weeks. 3 weeks." She thought about the 30-day notice that was now already 10 days into its count. She thought about Bram saying, "I've been scared of this for 2 years. You run out of scared eventually." She thought about the particular expression on Everett Crow's face when he'd handed her the paper and said, "Wise decision," the expression of a man who had never once in his adult life been wrong about an outcome. "He's going to move before 3 weeks," she said. Amos was quiet for a beat too long, which told her he already knew that. "There's a chance," he said carefully, "that when he realizes you're not going to fold and the deadline is approaching, he'll escalate." "Escalate," she said. "You mean he'll send men? He has sent men before." In other situations, he met her eyes. "Your property is remote. A snowstorm provides cover. Those are facts I'm aware of and that I am actively working against." He paused. "But you should be aware of them too." She nodded. "Once slow, Bram should know about you," she said. It was not a request. Amos considered it for a moment. Then he said, "Yes. Tell him tonight. Tell him everything we discussed. Tell him I said to stay on the ridge and stays armed and let me do my job." She stood up, pulled her coat tighter. "One more thing," she said. "Mrs. Calder Thomas Denton," she said, "the clerk. He's scared and he ran, and his sisters live south of here." He's the one who copied that ledger and got it to Bram, and right now he's sitting 12 miles away thinking he's probably a loose end that someone is eventually going to tie off. She looked at Amos steadily. If you're serious about this case, you need him to feel safe. You need him to know there's a federal warrant coming and that his testimony matters and that he's not going to be left standing alone when this is over. Amos looked at her for a moment with the same expression Mary Beth had used assessing, deciding. I'll reach out to him, he said. Today, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. The expression of a man who is, despite himself, slightly impressed. Today, he agreed. She went back to Mary Beth's store. She drank the rest of her cold tea. She told Mary Beth, in the condensed, essential version, what she'd learned, that there was a federal investigation, that it was close, that they needed to hold steady for 3 weeks. Mary Beth listened without interruption, which was possibly the most disciplined thing Cora had ever watched another person do. When she finished, Mary Beth said, 3 weeks. 3 weeks. And in the meantime, Crow doesn't know any of this. No. Mary Beth picked up her teacup, found it empty, set it back down. He came into this store yesterday, she said. Crow. He bought nothing. He just walked through and looked at things and smiled at me. And before he left, he said she stopped. Her jaw set. He said, I imagine things are difficult up on the ridge. Married life takes adjustment, and he smiled. She looked at Cora. That man knows how to threaten a person without saying anything that can be repeated in a court of law. Cora felt the anger move through her, clean and cold. Yes, she said. He does, so do we need to be afraid? Cora thought about what Bram had said the night they'd argued gently, about fear. A little, but not enough to stop. A little, she said. But not enough to stop. She was back on the ridge by mid-afternoon. The snow was heavier now, the kind that came down in large, slow flakes and covered everything quietly and made the world look simpler than it was. Splitting wood in the yard when she came up the track, and he stopped and watched her come and said nothing until she was close enough to speak without raising her voice. She told him about Amos Red, all of it, as directly as she could. He listened with the stillness she'd come to recognize as his version of full attention, absolutely no movement, eyes on hers, hands loose at his sides. When she finished, he looked at the axe in his hand for a moment, then drove it into the splitting block. Federal, he said. Yes, he's been here since September. On and off, he looked at the snow coming down. He knew about the ledger. He engineered getting it to you. Through Denton, he was quiet for a moment. That's he stopped. Started again. I thought Denton came to me because he had a conscience. Maybe he did, she said, and maybe Amos Red recognized a man with a conscience and pointed him at the right door. That doesn't make what Denton did less real. He looked at her. People can be used and still be themselves, she said. Those aren't mutually exclusive. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said 3 weeks, if we can hold, and if Crow moves first. Then we deal with that. He looked at the woodpile. At the house, at the tree line, where the pines were already white-capped with the afternoon snow. I need to check the rifles, he said, not alarmed. Factual, the way he said most important things. I know, she said. And I need to know, he turned to look at her, full, direct. Are you all right? The question surprised her slightly. In the weeks since she'd arrived, he hadn't asked her that directly. Not once. He'd watched her. She'd felt that carefully, from the corners of rooms, the way a person watches something fragile they're not sure how to hold. But he hadn't asked. She thought about it honestly. I'm angry, she said, which is better than scared. And I'm tired of Everett Crow having all the power and us having to be patient about it. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. His face was open in a way she hadn't seen it before, not a lot, not dramatically, just slightly, like the window cracked rather than thrown wide. He meant it. He was asking about her, the person, not the situation. She felt something loosen a little in her chest. I'm all right, she said. Better than I was a month ago. She paused. Much better. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, and pulled the axe out of the splitting block. "Go inside," he said. "It's cold, so are you. I'll be in when the wood's done." She went inside. She put the kettle on. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him work through the snow steady, rhythmic, completely absorbed in the immediate task the way she'd noticed he always was. The way a man gets when the immediate task is the only thing he's allowing himself to feel, and she thought about what Mary Beth had said. It was like watching a house get boarded up. You could see the light go out room by room. She thought the boards were coming down, slowly, one at a time. She thought she might be a reason for that, and that thought was complicated in a way she was not yet ready to examine directly. So she filed it in the same place. She'd filed the warmth of his hand and the cracked window of his expression when he'd asked if she was all right, and she made the tea and waited for him to come inside. The next 2 weeks were the longest and most tightly wound of Cora's life, and she had not previously understood the particular exhaustion of waiting for something you know is coming, but cannot predict. Every sound outside at night woke her, every visitor on the track below, and there were two, both innocent, both routine, made her chest tighten until she could confirm it. She kept the ledger and the 3 pages of discrepancies, and Aldous' letter in a flat leather case that she'd made from a piece of scrap hide in the barn, and she kept that case in the inside pocket of her heaviest coat, because if they ever needed to leave in a hurry, she was not leaving the evidence behind. Bram moved differently during those 2 weeks. Not anxious he didn't do anxious, or if he did it was invisible but alert in a quiet, constant way. He varied which windows he checked in the morning. He made sure the horses were never left unsecured at night. He moved the cash he kept in the house to 3 different locations, which was a practical thing she would not have thought of. And every evening after dinner, without explanation or ceremony, he cleaned and checked both rifles and the revolver that lived on the high shelf in the kitchen, and set them back in their places. On the 14th night, after she'd spoken with Amos Red, the snow came back. Not light flakes this time. A real mountain storm, the kind that came down off the high ridge with a sound like a living thing and dropped a foot of snow in 6 hours and made the world outside the windows white and opaque and very, very close. Bram had prepared for it. He always prepared for it. She understood now. This was a man whose relationship with winter was old and thorough, and the firewood was stacked inside against both walls of the kitchen, and the animals were secured, and there was food enough for 2 weeks without leaving the house. They sat at the kitchen table that evening, with the lamp lit and the storm loud against the roof, and Bram was repairing a piece of... and Cora was reading the poetry book she'd taken down from the shelf for the first time. She hadn't asked him about it. She'd just taken it, and he'd seen her take it and said nothing. It was not the kind of poetry she'd expected, not the formal, distant kind she'd encountered in the 2 weeks of school she'd gotten beyond the basic primer. It was working poetry about mountains and rivers, and the specific quality of light in a high valley in October, and the feeling sometimes being present that you couldn't name. She understood why the spine was broken from use. She read a poem twice that she thought might be the one that had made someone write, so you remember, there are beautiful things. She looked up and found Bram watching her. He looked back down at the harness immediately. "Who gave you this book?" she said. He kept his eyes on the harness. "Ruth." She looked at the inscription again, for B. "She had good taste," she said. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then she had good taste in most things. Is that a comment on the rest of her choices? Something moved in his face. "No," he said. The flatness in his voice had something behind it, a warmth, very old, the warmth of a grief that had been carried long enough that it had gotten heavy and familiar. She was a very wise woman, better than the situation she was in. Better than... He stopped. "We came up here because I thought the timber operation was going to work." She believed me. She believed everything I told her about what this place could be. "It could still be those things," Cora said. "Quiet." He looked at her. "The timber operation," she said. "The orchard. What you thought this place could be." She held his gaze. "Those things don't belong to her past. They're still here. The north face is still there. The soil is still right." He was very still. I'm not trying to replace anything, she said. I'm not saying I know what this place means. I know about the locked door and I know what's in it, and I'm not asking you to open it or close it or do anything about it at all. But what Ruth believed in when she came up here, what she saw in you when you told her what this mountain could be, she paused. That wasn't wrong. It's just not finished yet. The storm pushed against the house. The lamp made their shadows large on the wall behind them. Bram set down the harness. He looked at his hands for a moment. He said, "Why are you?" and stopped. "Why am I what?" she said. "You could have been afraid of this place. You could have come up here and kept your head down and waited for it to be over." He looked at her. "Most people would have. I'm not most people," she said. "I'm Thomas Whitlock's daughter. What does that mean?" "It means he taught me to work and to think and to be honest about what I see," she said. "And then he made a desperate decision, and it brought me here, and I was furious at him for it. And I'm still a little furious at him for it." But she looked around the kitchen. At the lamp, at the stacked firewood, at the harness on the table, and the rifle on the high shelf, and the window with the snow pressing white against it. "This isn't what I thought it was going to be. Any of it," she met his eyes. "You're not what I thought you were going to be." He held her gaze. "What did you think I was going to be?" "Terrible," she said honestly. "I thought you were going to be terrible." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I thought you were going to last a week." She blinked. A week, maybe 2. The faintest line appeared at the corner of his mouth. "You lasted longer." She stared at him. "That's the most backhanded thing anyone has ever said to me." "It's a compliment. It is a very bad compliment, Bram." He looked almost amused. It was a partial expression, incomplete, like a word said under the breath, but it was there, and she'd learned to catch them before they disappeared. "You were standing in a bank office being told to sign your life away," he said. "And you were adding columns in your head while you did it. I heard that from Garrett, who was in the back office, and could see your face." The almost amusement faded into something more serious. "I knew you were going to be a problem." "A problem," she repeated. "For Crow." She let that sit for a moment. "And for you?" He picked up the harness again. "The jury's still out," he said. She laughed. It came out before she could stop it, a short, surprised laugh that she hadn't made in so long. It felt strange in her throat. He looked at her when she laughed, and the something in his expression that was not quite amusement settled into something quieter and more careful. And she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything, and it was fine. It was more than fine, actually. It was the kind of fine that happens when two people have stopped pretending not to know something they both know, and have decided by mutual unspoken agreement to let that knowing sit quietly in the room without making demands of it. It was 3 days after that night when Amos's Red came up the mountain. He came alone and in daylight, which told Cora something before he even opened his mouth, because a man who'd been operating carefully and quietly for 8 months in this town did not change his behavior for small reasons. He tied his horse at the porch post and came up the steps and knocked, and when Bram opened the door, his expression was controlled but not entirely calm. "The warrant came through this morning," he said. "Federal authorization." "I'm moving tonight." Cora was in the doorway of the kitchen. She heard it, and something in her chest pulled tight and then released in a long, complicated wave. "Tonight," Bram said. "There's a problem," Amos said. He came inside, because standing on the porch in January on the side of a mountain was nobody's idea of a productive conversation. He looked at both of them. Crow got word. "Not from me, not from anyone I control. But he has sources, and one of them I don't know who yet told him something is moving. He spent this morning closing accounts and moving paper." He paused. "And this afternoon he sent men up the south track." The kitchen went very quiet. "How many men?" Bram said. 3, Amos said, armed. "Garrett from the livery is one of them, which I'm sorry to say because I always thought he was just a messenger, but apparently he's more than that." He looked at Bram. "They're not coming up here to talk." Bram turned to the high shelf. His hands were already on the rifle. "I have 2 deputies riding from the South Road," Amos said. They'll intersect the track below the ridge. But there's a window probably an hour where they're still coming up and I'm not yet in position. He looked at Cora. I need you to go to the back of the house, the bedroom. Stay down and away from windows. Cora looked at him. Then at Bram, who had the rifle loaded and was checking the revolver with the focused, unhurried movements of a man who has done this before. She felt the fear, yes, the real kind now, not the managed kind she'd been carrying for weeks, move through her in one full cold wave. And then it went, not because she wasn't in danger. She was in danger. She knew she was in danger. It went because she looked at Bram Calder, standing in his kitchen on the mountain he'd built his life on and lost his family on and refused to give up on. And she thought about everything they'd worked for over the past weeks, the ledger, the letter, the 3 pages, the widow Gaines with her box of documents under the bed, Thomas Denton possibly being reached right now by a federal marshal who'd promised him he wouldn't stand alone, and she thought, no. Give me the revolver, she said. Both men looked at her. I know how to shoot, she said. My father taught me. And you need more than one person watching more than one direction. She looked at Bram. Give me the revolver. Bram looked at her for a moment. His expression was doing something complicated worry and assessment, and something that was not quite pride, but was in the same territory. The territory of a man being surprised in a direction he hadn't anticipated. He held out the revolver, grip first, she took it. And then the sound of horses came up the track from below, moving fast through the snow, and the last of the light was going. And Everett Crow's men were coming up the mountain with bad intent, and a deadline they thought was already passed. And on Blackpine Ridge, in a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and pine and the faint ghost of tea, 3 people stood and faced the door, and none of them moved, and none of them ran. Outside, the mountain held its breath. The horses came up the south track at a pace that told Cora everything she needed to know about the intentions behind them. Not cautious, not tentative. The pace of men who had been told this was already decided, that the outcome was settled before they arrived, that they were just there to make the ending official. Bram moved to the window without being told to and looked out through the gap at the edge of the curtain. His face in profile was very still. 3 horses, he said. Garrett in front. 2 men I don't recognize behind him. Hired, Amos said. He was already at the far side of the room, back against the wall, revolver drawn. He moved like someone who had done this enough times that his body knew the geometry of it without being instructed. Crow uses men from outside the county for this kind of work. Less complicated afterward. Cora stood at the kitchen doorway with the revolver in her right hand and her back to the interior wall of the hall, which gave her a sight line to both the front door and the kitchen window, without being visible from outside. She had figured that out in the 30 seconds between taking the gun and the horses arriving on the track, which was not the way she'd expected her mind to work under pressure, but apparently it did. They'll try the door first, Bram said, still at the window. Crow will have told them to make it look like a conversation if they can. They're not here for a conversation, Amos said. No, Bram said. But they'll pretend for a minute. He was right. The knock, when it came, was almost polite. 3 solid raps on the front door, the kind a man makes when he wants to project authority rather than threat, and then Garrett's voice from the porch called her. Mr. Crow wants to make you a final offer on the property. Better if we talk face to face. Bram didn't move from the window. Cora watched his shoulders. She'd gotten good at reading him through his shoulders, which was where he carried tension when he didn't put it anywhere else. Calder, Garrett said again, less polite this time. We know you're in there, Bram said, loudly enough to be heard through the door without raising his voice. It was a peculiar skill of his, that controlled projection. I've got nothing to say to Crow. And I've got nothing to say to men who ride up my mountain after dark. A pause from outside. Then a different voice, one of the 2 strangers, said something low that Cora couldn't catch, and she heard boots shifting on the porch boards, and Bram stepped back from the window and said, very quietly, they're spreading out. Amos moved immediately toward the back of the house. Side window, he said. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not the organized, sequential kind of danger that existed in stories. It was the other kind, overlapping and loud and full of wrong sounds in unexpected places. Glass broke at the side window before Amos reached it. Bram put himself between the sound and the kitchen doorway, where Cora was standing without seeming to decide to. It was just where he was. Suddenly, between her and the breaking glass, rifle up. Garrett hit the front door with his shoulder, which was either brave or stupid, depending on how afraid he was of Crow, and the latch held, but the frame cracked. Then Cora brought the revolver up and kept it level, and thought with extraordinary clarity about the angle of the door and where a man would be standing on the other side of it if he hit it with his left shoulder versus his right. Amos's voice from the side room, Federal Marshal. Stop where you are, a beat of silence. Then two things happened at once. Garrett hit the front door again, harder, and the latch gave, and the window Amos was covering erupted in a second break of glass and a shape coming through it. And the house became very loud and very close for a short, terrible span of time. Cora did not fire the revolver. She came close to the man who came through the side window and collided with Amos Red. In the hallway was between her and Bram for a moment, and she had the weapon up and her finger on the guard, and she made the decision she would think about for a long time afterward. Not yet. Not until you're certain. Not until you're sure what's behind him. It was the right call. Amos had the man down in under a minute, not elegantly, not without cost to his left sleeve, which tore badly on the window frame, and Bram had Garrett against the front door frame by the collar, and Garrett was making the sounds of a man who has just encountered a much larger problem than he'd anticipated. The third man outside didn't come in. They heard him on the porch for a moment, and then they heard horse hooves on the track, moving fast, going down. Going to report back. Amos looked at Bram over the man pinned to the floor. Both of them breathing hard. Bram's rifle was still up. Your deputies, Bram said. They should have him before he clears the first switchback, Amos said. He didn't sound entirely certain of this. Should, Bram said. Yes, should. Amos pulled the man on the floor's arms behind his back with a practiced motion. Either way, this is over tonight. One way or the other, this is over tonight. Garrett, still held against the door frame by Bram's grip, said nothing. He was staring at the floor, and his face was the color of old tallow, and Cora had the thought, looking at him, that he had not actually expected this to be what it was. He'd probably told himself it was just a business errand. He'd probably told himself he was just a messenger who happened to ride with the wrong people on the wrong night, and somewhere between the bank and the mountain, he'd crossed a line he'd convinced himself didn't exist. Garrett, she said. He looked at her. His eyes were scared in a very naked way. Crow is going to prison, she said, flat and certain as she could make it. What happens to you depends entirely on what you decide to do in the next 5 minutes. His mouth worked. He said it was just, I know what he said, she said. He's very good at saying things. That's how he does it. She looked at him steadily. Tell Amos what you know about the other properties. The Harmons, the Pelletiers, everything you moved for him, everything you carried, every envelope that went somewhere you weren't supposed to ask about. She paused. All of it. She would find out later from Amos that Garrett talked for 2 hours. But that was later. In the immediate aftermath, with the broken window letting cold air into the side room, and the lamp throwing long shadows across everything, the first thing Cora did, after Amos had both men secured, was walk to the kitchen and sit down in the chair she always sat in and put the revolver on the table and put both her hands flat on the wood and breathe. She was shaking. She hadn't noticed during it. She noticed now. Bram came and stood in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her hands on the table. He came and pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and he put his own hands on the table. And she looked at them, massive and scarred from years of work, completely steady, and then she looked up at him. You're shaking, he said. I know, she said. It'll stop. I know it will, he said. They sat there for a moment. Just that. She was shaking, and her hands were flat on the table, and he was across from her, and outside the deputies had apparently intercepted the third man because they heard horses coming up the track multiple this time, organized, with purpose, and the crisis was resolving itself into the loud, procedural, exhausting aftermath that crises always became eventually. But for that one moment in the kitchen, it was just the two of them. She was shaking, and he was steady, and neither of them said anything that needed to be said out loud. Amos arrested Everett Crow at his home at 11 o'clock that same night. Cora was not there for it. She heard about it from Amos the following morning when he came back up the ridge to collect the ledger and the letter from Aldous and the 3 pages of discrepancies she'd carried in the inside pocket of her coat, and she handed all of it to him with both hands, as if she were handing him something heavier than its actual weight, which in a way she was. He didn't resist, Amos said. He tried to negotiate. He offered money, then information about other parties, then he told me I didn't understand what I was doing. He paused. He was very calm about it, the kind of calm that comes from believing until the last possible moment that the situation will reverse. Did it? No, Amos said. He looked at the leather case in his hands. No, it did not, he left. And then it was just the mountain again, and the snow, and the quiet that was different from the quiet before, still deep, still full of pine and cold air and the distant sound of the ridge, but different in a way Cora couldn't entirely name until Bram came in from the barn that afternoon, and she said, "It's quieter." And he looked at her and said, "The weight's different." And she thought, yes. That's exactly it. The weight is different. What followed Crow's arrest was not the clean, swift resolution that Cora had, on some optimistic level, imagined. It was instead the long, uneven, frequently frustrating work of a legal case that involved multiple properties, multiple victims, federal jurisdiction, a county official who turned out to have been taking regular payments from Crow, and a team of lawyers from the city who showed up to represent Crow and immediately began doing what lawyers did, which was complicate everything as expensively as possible. Thomas Denton came back. Amos had reached him that day, the day he'd promised Cora he would, and Denton had agreed. After a long conversation that Amos described as difficult, and that Cora suspected had involved significant fear and significant courage in equal measure, to testify. He arrived in Ashford 10 days after the arrest, thinner than Cora had expected for a man she'd built up in her mind as someone who'd carried a large secret. And he sat in Mary Beth Calhoun's back room and drank tea and confirmed every column in the ledger he'd copied. Bram sat across from him at that meeting. Denton had not met Bram before their communication had gone through intermediaries, and the first time he saw the scarred mountain man who'd been given his copy of the ledger, Cora watched Denton go very careful, and still in the way people did when they were frightened of what they were looking at. And then Bram said, "You took a real risk, getting that ledger. I want you to know I understand that." Denton looked at him for a moment. Something in his face changed. "I was more scared of leaving than of getting caught," he said. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," Bram said, "it does." And they moved on to the work. The widow Gaines came in from her daughter's house with the box she'd kept under her bed, and everything she'd preserved, every letter, every notice. Every document was cataloged by Amos and added to the federal case file. The Harmon family, who had moved 2 counties over after losing their farm, sent a written account through a county clerk that was witnessed and notarized. A man named Pelletier, the son, not the father who'd lost the mill, the father having died the winter after the foreclosure, came in person and testified with the particular cold fury of someone who has been waiting for this specific room for a very long time. Cora watched all of this from the edges of rooms and courthouse hallways and Mary Beth's back room, and she understood something she hadn't fully understood before. The reason Crow had been able to do what he did for as long as he did it was not that he was particularly brilliant. He was organized and cold and patient and willing to do what good people weren't willing to do. But mostly he'd succeeded because his victims had each thought they were alone. She said that to Mary Beth one afternoon, standing in the front of the store with the winter light coming through the window and the main street of Ashford going about its ordinary business outside. That's how it always works, Mary Beth said, same as any bully. Make each person feel like they're the only one, and the only ones are always too ashamed to compare notes. He used the shame, Cora said. The families who lost their properties, they believed on some level that they'd failed. That if they'd been smarter or more careful or more successful, it wouldn't have happened. Yes, Mary Beth said. That's exactly what he used. Cora was quiet for a moment. We should say that, she said. Not in the courthouse. Out here. Publicly. These families should hear each other say it so they understand they didn't fail individually. They were robbed collectively. Mary Beth looked at her. You want to hold a public meeting. I want people to talk to each other, Cora said. In a room, where they can see they're not alone, before the trial. So they walk into that courthouse knowing they're standing with other people, not as isolated plaintiffs who happen to be processed by the same system. Mary Beth was quiet for a moment, then she said, That will make Crow's lawyers very unhappy. Good, Cora said. The meeting was held in the community hall on the second Saturday of February, and it was, by any measure, messy and imperfect and too long, and not everything said in it would have held up to legal scrutiny, but none of that was the point. The point was that 11 families sat in the same room for the first time, and they listened to each other, and somewhere in the middle of the second hour, when old Mrs. Gaines was describing the afternoon she'd received the foreclosure notice, and thinking she was the only person Crow had ever done this to, the man next to her, who turned out to be the elder Pelletier's son, said, the exact same afternoon. Same language on the paper. I still have it, and something happened in the room that Cora felt more than saw. It was the sound of people stopping feeling alone. She was standing at the back of the hall. Bram was beside her, which had surprised her. He had come down from the mountain of his own decision, without being asked, and he'd sat through the first hour quietly, and then moved to stand at the back, and he'd been there beside her since. She'd felt him beside her in the way you feel a wall you trust present, weight-bearing, not requiring acknowledgement. She looked at the room in front of them, at 11 families who had all believed they were isolated failures and were discovering they were connected members of a deliberate crime. She said low enough that only he could hear, this is what he didn't account for. What? Bram said. That we'd talk to each other. Bram was quiet for a moment. He thought you'd be too ashamed. He thought I'd be too scared, she said. She looked up at him sideways. He didn't know who he was dealing with. Something moved across Bram's face. That thing she'd catalogued, the partial expression, the almost smile, the thing smaller than a smile but in the same territory. He looked back at the room. No, he said very quietly. He did not. It was 2 days after the community meeting that Bram came to her with the document. She was in the kitchen, which was where she was most mornings, and he came in from the study with a paper in his hand that was different from the notices and ledgers and letters she'd gotten used to seeing him carry. He set it on the table and said, I had the surveyor come up last week. Aldous, she looked at the paper. It was a property survey. Detailed and precise, with the boundary lines of Blackpine Ridge marked out carefully. And within the larger boundary, a section on the north faced the sheltered field, the one with the soil that drained well, was marked out in its own lines. 200 acres. Her name written at the bottom as sole owner. She stared at it for a moment. Bram, she said. It's already filed, he said. County clerk's office. It was filed yesterday. She looked up at him. He was standing across the kitchen in his usual way, not filling the doorway, performing anything, just standing there with his hands at his sides and his face open in the way it only opened when he wasn't watching himself. That's your land, she said, your family's land. Ruth's, it's a piece of the north face, he said. The piece he stopped, the piece that's supposed to be an orchard. She looked at the paper again, at her name in the surveyor's careful hand. She pressed her lips together for a moment because something was moving in her chest that she was not going to cry about in the kitchen at 8 in the morning. This isn't because you feel obligated, she said. It came out careful. No, he said. or because of the legal situation, or because you're trying to protect the property from. Cora, his voice was quiet and direct. It's because you've earned it. And because he stopped, took a breath, because it's yours. I want it to be yours. She looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze. He always did now, which had become the ordinary thing between them, looking directly, meaning what was said, not performing anything. Okay, she said. Her voice came out a little rough. Okay. He nodded. He started to turn back toward the study, the way he did when a thing was said and settled, and he didn't know what to do with the silence after it. She said, Bram, he stopped. When this is over, she said. When the trial is done and the legal work is done and everything is settled, I want to plant the orchard. She paused. Together. I want us to do that together. He stood with his back to her for a moment. Long enough that she wondered. Then he turned around. His face, the whole of it, the scarred side and the unscarred side, both of them, the full unguarded face of him, was doing something she hadn't seen before. Not the partial expression, not the almost smile, something that was larger than those things and older than them. Something that had been behind them all along, waiting for a moment too specific to come until now. Together, he said. Not a question, together, she said. He nodded once, slowly, and went back to the study, and she heard him sit down at the desk. And she turned back to the kitchen window and looked at the north face of the ridge through the glass, white with snow and stubbled with pine, and she thought about apples. She thought about Ellie, who had asked for them every time Bram came down from the mountain. She thought about Ruth, who had believed in this place and this man, and had written in the front of a poetry book, so, you remember, there are beautiful things. She thought about a 19-year-old girl who had signed her name in a bank office 3 months ago and looked up at a mountain in the distance and thought she was looking at the place she was going to disappear. She was still on the mountain. She had not disappeared. She had, in fact, become something neither she nor anyone else had expected. Not just a wife who had survived, not just a woman who'd been wronged and sought justice. Something more complicated and more specific than either of those things. Something that had grown out of cold mornings and shared silences, and the work of sitting at a table and adding columns by lamplight with a man who made coffee before he was asked and named his sorrows without. Flinching when someone sat still enough to listen. The trial of Everett Crowe was set for the end of March. The federal charges were serious, and the state had added charges of its own. And the lawyer situation had become even more complicated when 2 of Crowe's legal team withdrew over a payment dispute, which Amos told Cora about with the expression of a man trying very hard not to look pleased. The case was solid. It was solid in the way that 8 months of federal investigation, plus a ledger, plus 11 families, plus Thomas Denton's testimony made things solid, which was comprehensively and from several angles at once. But Everett Crowe was still on bail, and bail was the thing Cora kept coming back to. She mentioned it to Amos the last time she saw him before March, when he came up to the ridge to confirm what documentation they'd need for her testimony. The bail condition is tight, Amos said. He's not to leave the county. He has to report to the sheriff's office twice a week. He won't, she said. Amos looked at her. He won't follow the bail conditions, she said. He never followed rules he thought applied to other people, not once in his entire career. He signed a railroad agreement on property he didn't own. He falsified federal banking documents. He sent armed men up a mountain to intimidate a property owner. He is not a man who behaves differently just because someone tells him to. She met Amos's eyes. He's going to run, or he's going to do something worse. Amos was quiet for a moment. I've made my concerns about the bail arrangement known, he said, which was the careful way of saying he agreed with her. Known to whom, she said. To the circuit judge. And he looked at his hands. The circuit judge has a complicated relationship with several of Crowe's associates. She stared at him. I know, he said. I know. I'm working on it. She thought about the letter to the State Banking Commission that Mary Beth had written years ago, the one that came back, saying everything had been reviewed and found to be in order. She thought about the word complicated and everything it contained. She thought about how long Crow had operated, and why, and who had found reasons not to look too closely. She said, "Amos, how many people does he have in his pocket?" Amos was quiet for a beat longer than she would have liked. "Fewer than he did," he said. The arrest scared several of them into distance. But he paused. "Not zero, not zero." She filed that away. She filed it alongside the bail condition and the complicated circuit judge and the two lawyers who'd withdrawn over a payment dispute, which she now thought about differently, not as a sign that Crow was financially struggling, but as a sign that he was moving money. Consolidating. Preparing. She went back inside after Amos left and found Bram at the kitchen window with his coffee, looking out at the ridge the way he did in the mornings. She stood beside him and looked at the same view and said, "Without preamble, he's not done." Bram didn't look at her. "I know," he said. "Amos thinks the bail conditions are sufficient." "Amos is a good marshal," Bram said, "but he spent 8 months building a legal case, and legal cases make you think in terms of procedure. Crow doesn't think in terms of procedure. He thinks in terms of outcomes. And the outcome he wants. Is us not being here to testify?" Bram said. Flat. Certain. She absorbed that. "Then we need to be ready," she said. "We've been ready," he said. She looked at his profile. The daylight was the particular cold, clear light of late winter, and it caught the ridge of his cheekbone and the line of his jaw and the silver of the scarring and all of it together. All of him was so familiar to her now that it had stopped being something she cataloged and become something she simply knew. The way you know the layout of a room you've lived in long enough. "Bram," she said. He looked at her. She thought about what she wanted to say and realized there were several things stacked behind it, and she wasn't going to sort through all of them right now, not with Crow still out on bail and March approaching and the trial still ahead of them. So she pulled out what was on top. "When this is over," she said. "For real over. Not just the arrest, not just the trial. When it's done." She stopped. "Started again. I want to stay." He looked at her, not with surprise, more with the expression of someone who has known something for a while and has been waiting for the moment when it became a thing that could be said out loud. "I know," he said. It's not about the land deed," she said. "That's not why." "I know," he said again. She looked at him. "You knew before I did." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe," he said. She shook her head, looked back out the window. Felt the complicated warmth of it, this thing that had grown up in the cold and the danger and the lamp-lit evenings at a kitchen table, not because anyone had arranged for it or planned for it or needed it to be anything in particular, just because it had grown the way things grow when the conditions are right even when nothing else is. She thought about Ruth writing, "So you remember there are beautiful things." She thought about a 4-year-old girl who liked apples. She thought about a man who had boarded himself up room by room for 11 years and then stood in a kitchen one morning and said all right to a stranger who had flour on her hands and fury in her chest and nowhere left to go. She thought all of those things and didn't say any of them because some things didn't need to be said. They just needed to be known. Outside, the last of the winter light moved across the ridge. The trial was 23 days away, and Everett Crow, sitting somewhere in Ashford with a bail notice and a complicated judge and the slowly closing walls of a federal case, was not a man who waited for walls to close. Bram set his coffee cup down. He turned from the window and said, "I'm going to check the roof on the south side. Some of the boards took damage in the last storm." "Come," she said. He looked at her. "It's cold." "I know," she said. "I'll come anyway." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "Get your coat," and went to get his, and she went to get hers. And the leather case with the copies of all the documents, because she had copies now, and Amos had copies, and Mary Beth had copies. And the federal office had the originals. The leather case was still in the inside pocket where it always was, the small, dense weight of it like a hand against her ribs. They went out into the cold together. The mountain held them. The 23 days before the trial passed the way days pass, when you're waiting for something you can't control and trying to keep your hands busy enough that your mind doesn't eat itself. Cora had learned that about waiting it required occupation, specific and physical, otherwise it curdled into something unproductive and dark. So she worked. She helped Bram repair the south roof. She organized the study. She made 2 trips into Ashford to sit with Mary Beth and review the testimony she'd be giving, going over it with the methodical repetition of someone who knows that clarity under pressure has to be built in advance, not improvised on the day. Bram drilled fence posts in frozen ground and reshingled a section of the barn roof that had been questionable since autumn and rebuilt the gate on the lower pasture that had been hanging by one hinge since before Cora arrived. She watched him work sometimes from the kitchen window and thought about what Mary Beth had said, that he used to be a different kind of man before Hallow Creek. She thought she understood now that he wasn't a different man so much as a man who had learned to put most of himself away for safekeeping and had been living in the front room of himself for 11 years while the rest of the house sat dark. She understood that because she'd seen the lights come on. Slowly, one at a time, in the way Mary Beth had described them going out. A sentence at dinner that wasn't strictly necessary. A dry sideways remark about the weather or the horses that was close enough to a joke that she laughed, which made him look briefly startled and then satisfied. The morning he came into the kitchen and said, "Without any particular ceremony, I was thinking we'd need about 40 trees to start. For the orchard, maybe 50 if the deer pressure is what I think it is on the north face," and then poured his coffee and looked out the window as if he hadn't just said something that meant more than it appeared to mean. She'd said 50 then. Better to have more than not enough. And he'd said, "That's what I thought." And they'd both looked out the window at the ridge. And it had been ordinary in the way that things become ordinary when they've settled into being real. On the 14th day before the trial, Amos came up the mountain with his face carrying news that he was working to keep controlled. Cora saw it before he spoke. She'd learned his tells by now, the particular set of his jaw when something had not gone the way he'd planned for it to go, the slightly too careful way he dismounted when he was managing his own reaction. She brought him inside. Bram was already at the kitchen table and looked up when Amos came in and read him the same way she had. Amos sat down. He put his hat on the table. He said, "Crow didn't report to the sheriff's office this morning." The kitchen was quiet. He missed the second check-in in a row, Amos said. "Which technically triggers a warrant for bail violation, and I have that warrant, and I have 2 deputies looking." But he stopped. Looked at his hat. His house was empty this morning. Cleaned out. Not recently. I think he's been moving things for at least a week, probably more. "He's running," Bram said. "That's what it looks like," Amos said. Which is, in terms of the legal case, it's actually not the worst outcome. A fugitive who's fled implies consciousness of guilt. He stopped himself. That's the procedural argument. The problem is that Crow running and Crow simply being gone are 2 different things, and I'm not certain which one this is yet. Cora looked at him directly. "You think he might not be running?" Amos met her eyes. "I think Everett Crow has spent 20 years being a man who solves problems before they become problems. Running is an admission that the problem is already too large." And Crow paused. Crow still thinks he can manage this. He's arrogant in a specific way. He doesn't believe other people can outmaneuver him. He believes in last moves, a last move, Bram said. His voice was flat. "It's a possibility I'm taking seriously," Amos said. "Which is why I'm here. I want one of my deputies on this property until we locate him." "How long will that take?" Cora asked. "I don't know," Amos said. He said it with the honesty of someone who'd stopped pretending to certainties he didn't have. He has resources. He has contacts outside the county. If he wanted to simply disappear, he could be difficult to find. "But you don't think he wants to simply disappear," she said. Amos looked at her steadily. "No, I don't." She had known it was coming. She'd told Bram it was coming 19 days ago, standing at the kitchen window with the winter light on the ridge. The knowing didn't make it less heavy. It just meant she wasn't surprised, which was its own kind of grim, useful thing. Bram walked Amos to the door. She heard them speak quietly on the porch. She couldn't hear the words, just the register of the voices, low and measured. Two men agreeing on something with minimal waste of language. When Bram came back inside, she was already putting on her coat. He looked at her. "The leather case," she said. "I'm moving it." "Where?" "Not in the house," she said. "If he's thinking about last moves, the documents are a last move. If he burns the house, he'd have to burn the federal office," Bram said. "Amos has copies." "I know," she said, "but I want mine somewhere else anyway." She met his eyes. "There's a hollow in the rock formation above the spring house. I've been thinking about it as a cache since the first night Garrett rode up with those men." Bram looked at her for a moment. "You've been thinking about that since then?" "Think ahead," she said, "about bad outcomes. It's a habit." "It's a good habit," he said, and there was no irony in it at all. She put the leather case in a tin box she'd found in the back of the spring house, and she sealed it with wax against the moisture. And she climbed the rock formation above the spring, in the cold afternoon light, with Bram behind her in case the footing was worse than it looked. And she tucked the tin into the hollow in the rock, which was deeper and drier than it appeared from below. And she packed pine needles around it and stood back and looked at it and thought, "There. Whatever happens, there is a copy that is not in a building." The deputy arrived the next morning. His name was Hollis, and he was young mid-20s, slightly nervous in the way of someone who understood the assignment and was determined not to fail it, and he set himself up in the barn, which was warmer than it sounded and provided a sight line to both the main track and the tree line on the south side. 3 days passed with no word on Crow's location. Then 5, then a week. It was on the 8th day, a Thursday, the trial now 15 days away, that Cora woke at 2 in the morning with the absolute certain knowledge that something was wrong. She lay still for a moment and processed what had woken her. Not a sound, an absence of sound. The wind that had been moving through the pines all night had stopped, which sometimes happened at altitude, but this stopping had a different quality. More abrupt, as if something had moved through the trees, and the trees had gone quiet in response. She got up. She pulled on her boots and her coat over her nightgown, and she went to the window and looked out. The yard was dark. No moon cloud cover had moved in the afternoon before and hadn't cleared. The barn was a dark shape with a faint line of light under the door where Hollis had his lamp. She went to the hall, knocked once on Bram's door 2 sharp raps, the signal they'd agreed on. She heard him move immediately. The man slept lightly, or maybe not at all during these days. She wasn't entirely sure, and his door opened and he was already dressed, which told her she wasn't the only one who'd been lying awake. "Something outside," she said quietly. He already had the rifle. He went to the front window, and she went to the side window, and they both looked out and saw nothing, and for a moment she thought she'd been wrong, and then she smelled it. Smoke, not the wood smoke of the fire in the kitchen stove. Something sharper and more immediate. Something that smelled like the outside, like resin and scorched pine, coming from the wrong direction, not the chimney, not below the house, but from somewhere along the south exterior wall. "Fire," she said. He was already moving. She heard him go out the back, not the front, not where whoever was outside would expect him to go, and she heard him on the back porch, and then she heard the sound that changed everything, a shot, very close, from the direction of the barn. Hollis. She moved through the house with the revolver in her hand, and her mind working very fast through what she knew and what she didn't know. The south wall was burning. She could hear it now. A sound like paper catching, building quickly, the specific hungry sound of fire finding purchase on dry wood. The front of the house was the only exit that wasn't yet compromised. She went to the front door and put her hand on it and felt for heat, which was what her father had told her to do when she was small, and the door wasn't hot, and she opened it onto the cold night air and came out onto the porch. The yard in front of the house was empty. The smell of smoke was stronger out here. She looked up and saw orange light reflected in the low clouds from the south side of the house, and she understood with a cold, clarifying certainty that the fire was already significant and that she had perhaps 5 minutes before the interior became untenable. She went back inside. She took the lamp from the kitchen table. She went to the hall and then stopped because there was a voice from outside, from the back of the house, from where Bram had gone, and she recognized Bram's voice. But she couldn't hear what he was saying because there was another voice under it, and the other voice was Everett Crow's. She stood in the hall and listened, and her heart did something very loud and then steadied. Crow was here, not running, not gone. Here on the backside of the burning house he'd set a light, talking to Bram in the dark. She went out the front door again. She went around the north side of the house, not the south. The south was fire staying low against the wall, feeling the heat increase as she moved toward the back corner, and she stopped at the corner and looked. Bram was in the yard behind the house, perhaps 20 feet from the back porch. Crow was 10 feet from him. Crow had a gun, and in the orange light of the fire that was eating the south wall of the house, his face was doing something she had never seen on a human face before, a controlled, absolute fury that had run out of all its careful packaging and was now just fury, naked and total, in the face of a man who had spent 20 years believing he was owed the right to take what he wanted from people who were smaller than him. He looked wrong, not just angry, undone. His coat was rumpled, and his hair was loose, and he had the specific dishevelment of someone who has been moving and not sleeping and feeding a rage for a week straight, and is now standing in the dark behind a burning house, feeling the walls of the world close in and responding to that feeling by pushing back with everything he has left. "You had one job," Crow said. His voice was almost conversational. "That was the worst thing about it. Sign the property. Walk away. I was going to let your wife go back to her father. Clean, simple. Everybody walks away with what they need." "You were going to let her go back," Bram said. His voice was perfectly flat. "She was leverage," Crow said. "That's all. The moment you signed, she was unnecessary." He said unnecessary the way you say misplaced about a tool you don't particularly value. Cora felt the anger in her chest the way you feel a fire, immediate, physical, radiating. "You burned my house," Bram said. "I'll buy you a better one," Crow said. "After you sign, I still have a deed transfer in my coat. We can do it right now. And then I walk. And you and your wife walk. And that marshal does whatever marshals do. And this is over." "The marshal has a federal warrant," Bram said. "The marshal can be managed," Crow said. "I've managed every official in 2 counties for 15 years. One federal marshal is not—" "He's standing right behind you," Amos Red said. Crow spun. Cora had not heard Amos come around the other side. He was there, shirt sleeve still torn from the night Garrett's man had come through the window, which she registered absurdly with his revolver up and his stance completely settled, and behind him was Hollis, who had a cut above his eye but was upright and functional and also had his weapon out. Crow did not drop his gun. That was the moment that everything depended on. He stood between Amos behind him and Bram in front of him, and the fire was eating the south wall with increasing enthusiasm, and the light from it caught all of their faces. And Everett Crow looked at the situation with the expression of a man doing a last, rapid calculation and finding that the numbers do not work and refusing to believe it. He swung the gun toward Bram, pulled the trigger. The click of a misfire was the loudest sound Cora had ever heard. 1 second, maybe less. The gun failed mechanical failure, wet charge, something. She would never know exactly what, and in that 1 second, Amos crossed the 10 feet between them, with a speed that contradicted his ordinary deliberate movement, and had Crow's weapon arm controlled before Crow could cycle the action. And Hollis was there a step behind, and Bram had not moved, and the fire was very loud, and it was over. It was over. Crow went down onto his knees in the dirt behind the burning house, and Amos had him in irons before he'd finished falling. And for a moment nobody said anything, and the fires spoke for all of them, loud and consuming, and already too far along to stop. Cora came around the corner of the house. Bram turned at the sound of her footsteps and looked at her with the full, unguarded face she'd come to know, and the firelight was on him, and he was unhurt. And she crossed the yard and stopped 2 feet from him, and he looked at her and said, "Are you hurt?" "No," she said. "Are you?" "No." She looked at the house. The south wall was gone. The fire had moved to the roof on that side, and the kitchen, their kitchen, the table where they'd added ledger columns and drunk cold coffee and learned each other was audible in the way that things burning become audible. A deep structural sound under the surface crackling. She looked at it and felt the loss of it move through her, clean and real, and then she felt something else move through her. Right behind it, the knowledge that loss was not the end of things. That she knew this, had always known this, had learned it from her father, and from the comb in her bag she couldn't throw away, and from watching a man live in the front room of himself for 11 years, while the rest of the house sat dark. "We can build it back," she said. Bram stood beside her. He was looking at the house, too. His jaw was tight and his hands were loose, and she could see the cost of it on him, this place. His place? Ellie's room at the end of the hall, Ruth's poetry book on the shelf. She said very quietly, "The book." He looked at her. "The poetry book," she said. "Where was it?" He looked back at the house. "Study shelf," he said. The study was on the north side. The fire had come from the south. She thought about it for a moment, calculated the angles, the progress of the fire, and then she walked toward the house. Bram caught her arm. "North side," she said. The study's on the north side, and the fire started south. "I have 2 minutes before it reaches the interior walls." She looked at him. 2 minutes, he looked at the house, at her. His hand on her arm tightened once and then released, and he said, "1 minute," and came with her. The study was smoky but not yet compromised. The heat was present in the way. Heat is present in a house that is burning somewhere else in itself, an ambient wrongness in the air, not yet immediate. She went straight to the shelf. The book was there, spine broken and familiar. She took it. She took the 3 pages of her handwritten discrepancies that were still in the desk drawer, which was redundant given that Amos had copies, but she took them anyway because they were hers. And Bram, beside her, opened the bottom drawer of the desk and took out something she hadn't known. Was there a small tintype photograph, the kind taken by a traveling photographer, oval-framed, 2 people and something very small between them. Ruth and Ellie. She didn't look at it directly. It wasn't hers to look at. She turned toward the door, and they went out through the front of the house together, and did not look back until they were in the yard. And by then, the kitchen ceiling was showing orange at its edges, and the thing that had been their house was becoming something else entirely. Amos came around from the back with Crow and Irons and Hollis behind them. He looked at the house. He looked at the 2 of them standing in front of it with a poetry book and a photograph and her coat over her nightgown. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," Cora said. "For the 2nd time that night." He nodded. He looked at Crow, who was on his feet but barely not physically damaged, just reduced, in the particular way of men who have bet everything on their own invincibility and found the bet was wrong. He looked smaller than she'd ever seen him. Not because he'd gotten smaller. Because the air around him had stopped doing what he'd always made it, do that banking of authority and menace that a man like Crow generated as naturally as breathing. It was gone. He was just a man in irons in the dirt behind a burning building, and he was looking at Cora Calder with an expression she had not expected. Rage, not calculation. Something that looked almost like recognition. Like he was seeing her, really seeing her. Possibly for the first time in understanding, too late, the specific nature of what he had underestimated. She held his gaze. She did not say anything. There was nothing she needed to say to Everett Crow that she hadn't already said in the 3 pages of discrepancies and the community hall on the 2nd Saturday of February and the box of documents the widow Gaines had kept under her bed. She had said everything she needed to say, so she just looked at him until he looked away. Which she did, and then she looked at the house that was burning, and then at the mountain that was not. Bram's hand found hers in the dark. Not a gesture, not performed, not reaching. Just there, the way things are there when they've been moving toward each other long enough. She held on. Everett Crow went to trial on a Thursday in late March when the snow on the lower slopes was starting to thin at the edges and the mud of early spring was making itself known in the ruts of the main road into Ashford. He was tried on 7 federal counts and 4 state charges, and the trial lasted 9 days, and the gallery was full every single day, not with curiosity seekers, though there were some, but with the families he had ruined, who came and sat in the courtroom and watched the evidence that they had kept in boxes and remembered in ledgers and carried in their bodies for years get laid out in front of a judge and a jury and turned into something official and witnessed and real. Cora testified on the 3rd day. She was not nervous in the way she'd expected to be nervous. She was nervous in a different way, the particular anxiety of wanting to be precise, of knowing that the words she used mattered, and that vague or emotional language would be less useful than clean, specific language, and concentrating so hard on that distinction that the gallery behind her and the lawyers on either side of the room and even Crow at the defense table receded into a kind of peripheral blur. Described what she had found, the ledger, the discrepancies, the process of cross-referencing them. She described the letter from Aldous. She described the community meeting in February, not as a legal exhibit, but as a response to the attorney's question about the impact on the community. And she answered that question in a way that she'd thought about for a long time, and that came out when she finally said it the way she'd wanted it to. What Mr. Crow understood about people, she said, was that if you isolate them and make them feel like they've failed individually, they will be too ashamed to compare notes. He was right about that. For a long time, he was completely right about that. And the only reason it stopped working was that someone asked questions out loud and in public, and once people heard each other's answers, they realized they hadn't failed at all. They'd been robbed by the same man in the same way, and the only difference between before and after that meeting was that they knew each other's names. The courtroom was quiet for a moment after she said it. Not a dramatic quiet, the kind that happens when a thing has been said that people are still processing. The defense attorney tried twice to reframe her testimony, and she answered him patiently and specifically both times. And the second time he sat back down, with the expression of a man who has tried to dismantle something that turns out to be better built than it looked. Bram testified on the 5th day. He was brief and factual and completely unshakable on cross-examination, which flustered the defense attorney in a different way. You could not rattle a man who had decided years ago to stop performing for audiences. He answered what was asked. He did not elaborate unnecessarily. He described the ledger and how he'd received it and what he'd understood it to mean. And when the attorney asked him why he hadn't brought the ledger to law enforcement immediately upon receiving it, he said, "Because law enforcement in this county was compromised, which I knew, and because a piece of copied paper without corroboration would have been dismissed or destroyed before it reached anyone with the authority to act on it." He paused. Which is exactly what would have happened. Nobody in the courtroom argued with that. Thomas Denton testified on the 7th day. He was frightened visibly, honestly frightened, which was not a weakness but was the truth of the situation, and it read as truth in the room. His voice shook slightly on the first 2 answers and then steadied, and he described copying the ledger pages and why he'd done it and what he'd seen while working for Crow. And his testimony was the kind that courts get rarely specific and detailed and delivered by someone with absolutely nothing to gain and a great deal of personal cost behind the telling of it. The widow Gaines testified on the 8th day. She was 67 years old, and she had kept every document in a box under her bed for 4 years, and she delivered her testimony with the composed, absolute precision of a woman who had been waiting for this specific room for a very long time. And when she was done, and the defense attorney said he had no questions, she looked at him for a moment before stepping down with an expression that said everything she'd chosen not to say out loud. Everett Crow was convicted on all 11 counts on the 9th day. Cora was in the gallery when the verdict came in. Bram was beside her. She heard the foreman say the word guilty and then heard it again and again, once for each count, and she sat very still through all of it, and when it was over she sat still for another moment, while the room around her began to move and breathe again. Then she exhaled, long all the way. Bram's hand found hers on the bench between them. She turned and looked at him. His face was still, as it almost always was, but something underneath the stillness was different, released, or releasing, like a fist that has been held closed for a long time slowly opening. She looked at that face that she now knew the way you know a landscape you've walked every day, the scar and the dark eyes and the jaw that held tension in the specific way she could read without effort now, and she felt something so large and so full that she did not try to name it or contain it. She turned his hand over and held it properly, fingers through fingers, and he squeezed once, brief and tight, and then they sat there in the Ashford County courtroom while the room emptied around them, and neither of them felt any need to move just yet. Everett Crow received a sentence of 14 years in federal custody. The county official who had taken his payments, the one with the complicated relationship that Amos had described, resigned before charges reached him and fled the county, and while Cora thought that was insufficient, she thought it less insufficient when Amos told her, with his carefully controlled expression, that the man had fled directly into the hands of a waiting federal officer in the next county. The corrupt judge who had approved the bail conditions received a formal censure from the state judicial board, which was also insufficient, but was also the beginning of an inquiry that Amos said would likely result in more. The stolen properties were returned through a process that took 8 months and was imperfect in the way that legal remediation is always imperfect. The Harmons got their land back, but could not recover the years they'd spent away from it. And the Pelletier mill had fallen into disrepair that cost more to fix than the compensation covered, and these were real losses that paperwork couldn't undo. The land came back. The records were corrected. The fabricated debts were expunged. Thomas Whitlock received a letter from the Federal Banking Authority confirming that no legitimate debt had ever been owed to Crow's Bank. And when Cora read that letter sitting at the table in the temporary cabin Bram had constructed on the north end of the property, while the house was rebuilt, she felt something that she had not entirely expected. Not triumph, but the quiet, particular satisfaction of a number that finally adds up correctly. She sent the letter to her father with her own note attached. The note said, "You made a desperate choice. I was angry about it. I'm less angry now. Come and visit when the road is clear in spring." He came in April. He was thinner than she remembered, and older than she remembered, and he stood at the edge of the property where the new house was going up. Bram and 2 men from town working on the frame, and he looked at it for a long moment and then looked at Cora. "You're all right," he said. It wasn't a question, but it was also a question. "I'm better than all right," she said, which was true and complicated and the most honest thing she could give him. He looked at Bram, who had come down from the frame when he saw them, and was standing at a respectful distance with sawdust in his hair and a level in his hand. Thomas Whitlock looked at him for a long moment at the scarring, at the size of him, at the face that most people couldn't get past, and then he crossed the distance and put out his hand. Bram shook it. Her father said, "She tells me you treated her right." "I tried to," Bram said. Her father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's not easy." He said it with the slight, helpless quality of a man admitting something that is both a complaint and a source of deep pride. "Never has been." "I know," Bram said. The corner of his mouth moved in the way she'd catalogued. "She's not supposed to be." Thomas looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded, once, with the particular nod of a man who has made a decision about another man's character and is filing it permanently. The new house was finished by late summer. It was larger than the old one. Not because they'd planned it larger, but because Bram had made certain accommodations in the frame that she only understood when the interior walls went up a room off the south side that had its own small stove and a south-facing window. And when she walked into it for the first time and stood in the light that came through the glass, felt immediately like somewhere a child would want to be. She stood in that room for a long time, then she went to find Bram. He was at the woodpile. She stood in front of him and waited until he'd set the axe down and turned to face her, and then she said, without preamble, the way she'd learned he preferred things said, the room off the south side. He met her eyes. Yes. She stopped, started again. Did you plan that? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I hoped. She looked at him. The afternoon light was doing what late summer light did on the ridge, going amber and long, catching the ridge line and the upper pine canopy and making everything look like something worth keeping. It caught him too, the full face of him, and she thought, as she sometimes did, about the night in the burning yard, when his hand had found hers in the dark and stayed there. Okay, she said. He blinked. Okay? Okay, she said again. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone parse a short answer for its full meaning, which she had learned to recognize as a thing he did when a thing mattered. Then something happened to his face, not the partial expression, not the almost something, but the full thing, the complete and unguarded version of warmth that she had seen once or twice in lamplight and firelight, and once in a courthouse gallery. And it made him look like the man he must have been before Hallow Creek, and also entirely like the man he was now. And she thought those might be the same thing finally, or close enough. They planted the orchard in October of that year, 50 apple trees on the north face, in the field with the sheltered soil that drained the way Bram had always known it did. It was harder work than she'd anticipated, and took 3 full days, and her back ached in ways she'd learned meant she'd done something real. Bram had sourced the stock from a nursery 2 counties over specific varieties, chosen for the altitude and the cold, and the particular conditions of a mountain that got hard winters but also long, clear summers with good light on that southern sheltered face. He had, she discovered, written to the nursery 3 times with detailed questions before deciding, which was exactly the way he approached anything he actually cared about. They put the last tree in the ground as the light was going on the 3rd day, and Cora stood up from her knees and put both hands on her lower back and looked at the 50 small trees in their orderly rows and felt something she could only describe as future tense. Not the future as an idea or a hope. The future is a physical thing, present in the ground, requiring only time. Bram stood beside her. He was looking at the trees. His hands were dirty, and his coat had mud on the hem, and his hair had gone loose from where he'd tied it back, and he looked tired in the straightforward, earned way of someone who has done 3 days of real work. She said Ellie would have liked this. She'd thought about whether to say it for the better part of the 3 days. It was the kind of thing that could go wrong, could be intrusive or presumptuous, or painfully wrong in tone. She decided to say it anyway because she believed it was true, and because she'd learned that Bram Calder, whatever else he was, did not want things kept from him in kindness. Quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought she'd misjudged. Then he said she would have eaten half of them before they were ripe. His voice was rough at the edges. Controlled but only just. Ruth used to say she'd never wait for anything. He stopped. She just went straight at things. Cora looked at the trees. She sounds like she was wonderful, she said. She was 4, he said. She'd only just started. He stopped again. When he spoke next, his voice had the quality of something being said that has been held for a very long time and has found, finally, a person to say it to. That was the part I couldn't, the part that kept. He stopped a 3rd time. She'd only just started. Cora reached out and took his hand. Not the reflex grip of a crisis. Just her hand in his, deliberate and quiet, in the fading October light on a mountainside with 50 small trees in the ground. He held on. They stood there for a while, long enough for the light to go fully and the first stars to show over the ridge. Long enough for the cold to come down from the high peaks and remind them they were at altitude, and October meant it. Long enough that the standing itself was the thing, not the waiting for something else. We should go in, he said eventually. In a minute, she said. He didn't argue. They stood another minute. Then they went in. They married again the following spring, not for debt or coercion or a banker's scheme. They married in the front room of the new house with Mary Beth Calhoun as witness and Amos Red. who had stayed in the territory after the trial on an extended assignment and had become the nearest thing to a regular visitor that Blackpine Ridge had ever had. Standing in the doorway, looking like a man who found ceremonies of this kind professionally unnecessary and personally affecting. Thomas Whitlock stood beside his daughter and did not cry, which cost him more than anything he'd done in a long time, and which she noticed and said nothing about. The ceremony was short. Bram was not a man for long ceremonies. She wasn't either. They said what needed to be said and meant all of it, and then Mary Beth said briskly that there was food on the table and they might as well use it, and they did. Their daughter was born 2 years after that. They named her Clara Cora's Choice, and she came into the world in the room off the south side that Bram had framed with hope and that had spent 2 years as a sewing room while they waited, which Cora had found quietly funny in a way she'd never explained to him. Clara had her mother's stubbornness and her father's eyes, and an early and absolute passion for the orchard that manifested first as a tendency to fall asleep under the apple trees in summer, and later as a working knowledge of every tree's variety, soil needs, and probable yield that would have impressed the nurseryman 2 counties over considerably. The orchard bore its first serious fruit 4 years after planting. Not everything that was never how orchards worked. Bram had told her that at the beginning, and she'd filed it away, but enough. Enough to taste. Enough to know that the soil was right, and the variety was right, and the sheltered north face was everything Bram had believed it was for 20 years before he ever planted a thing in it. She stood in the orchard on the day of the first real harvest and ate an apple that was tart and cold, and not quite perfect, a little small, slightly uneven. The skin marked in 2 places by something she'd have to identify and address, and she thought about a 4-year-old girl who would have eaten them before they were ripe and not cared at all about the marking on the skin. She thought about Thomas Whitlock standing with his hat in his hands in a bank office, looking smaller than she'd ever seen him. She thought about a 19-year-old girl adding columns in her head while someone handed her a pen and told her to sign something. She thought about 2 words in a quiet kitchen. All right. She thought about all the ways a person can be broken by loss, by cruelty, by systems designed to make you feel isolated and ashamed and too small to push back, and all the ways a person can decide, not once but repeatedly, in the small daily choices that nobody writes down and nobody witnesses, to get back up and do the next thing anyway. She thought that the stories people told were almost always about the dramatic moments. The confrontation, the verdict, the night the house burned. And those things mattered, they were real, and they were significant, and she wouldn't minimize them. But the truth she had learned on this mountain, slowly and imperfectly and at considerable cost, was that the dramatic moments were only possible because of all the undramatic ones. The ledger pages by lamplight, the coffee made before it was asked for, the orchard planned in a field that nobody had planted yet, the hand found in the dark and held. Mama, Clara's voice from the next row, where she'd been examining something on the bark of the 5th tree with the focused seriousness of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to pretend that small things aren't worth serious attention. What is it? Cora called. There's a bee in this one. A big one, just sitting there. Leave it alone. I'm not bothering it. I'm just watching it. Cora heard Bram's voice from the far end of the row where he'd been working since morning. Clara. Papa, come here a minute. A pause then, the sound of small feet moving through grass. Cora stayed where she was, eating the imperfect apple, listening to the sounds of the orchard, the wind in the upper pines, the distant creek. Her daughter's voice asking her father something in the tone of a child who asks questions, not because she expects to not know the answer, but because she wants the conversation. Bram's low voice answering Clara asking something else. The ordinary music of people who have found each other and stayed. Blackpine Ridge was not a gentle place. It never became one. The winters were hard and the work was constant, and there were years when the market was wrong, and years when the weather was wrong, and years when both were wrong at the same time, which was the nature of living at altitude and building something from the ground up rather than inheriting it. Nothing about it was easy. She would not have said she wanted it easy. What she would have said, what she did say, years later, when Clara was old enough to ask the question children eventually ask about how things started and whether they had to happen, the way they happened was this. The worst thing Everett Crow had done to any of them was try to convince them they were alone. That the power he'd held had been built entirely on that illusion that each person he wronged was an isolated case, a single failure, a small and manageable problem that couldn't connect to anyone else's small and manageable problem. And the moment that stopped being true, he was finished. She told Clara that in the kitchen of the house on Blackpine Ridge, at the table where she and Bram had once added ledger columns by lamplight and drunk each other's cold coffee and learned the slow, unspectacular, genuine truth of each other. Clara listened with the focused seriousness as she brought to everything, and then she said, "So the thing that beat him was people talking to each other?" "Yes," Cora said. Clara thought about it for a moment. "That doesn't sound very hard." "It was," Cora said. "It was one of the hardest things." Clara looked at her with her father's dark eyes and her mother's particular expression of someone deciding whether to accept an answer or push on it. Why? Cora thought about it, about shame and isolation, and the way a person can be so convinced of their own smallness that they can't imagine their story connecting to anyone else's. About the specific courage it takes to say out loud, in a room full of people, that something was done to you not because you failed, but because someone decided you were a convenient target. "'Cause it means admitting something happened to you," she said. "And most people would rather believe they could have stopped it." Clara absorbed that. "Could you have," she asked, "stopped it at the beginning?" Cora looked at her daughter, at this person who existed because two broken strangers had decided, without any particular reason for confidence, to try to fix something together. "No," she said honestly. Clara nodded. Slowly, the way Bram nodded when something settled into being true. "But together," she said. Cora looked out the kitchen window at the mountain. The ridge dark with pines. At the orchard on the north face, visible in summer from this window the rows of trees that were not yet full grown and would not be for years still, and that bore fruit anyway, imperfect and real and worth the keeping. Together, she said, yes, the mountain held them all, and it was enough.